To truly understand the weight of existence, we have to look at the world through the eyes of a man who saw birth not as a beginning, but as a primary catastrophe. Emil Cioran, in his seminal work The Trouble with Being Born, invites us into a space where we question the very merit of our arrival. We often spend our lives worrying about death, fearing the end of our timeline, but Cioran shifts the lens backward. He suggests that the real tragedy has already happened. It happened the moment we were pulled from the silence of non-existence into the noise of being. If you think about it, we are all survivors of a disaster that occurred 9 months before we were even aware of ourselves. This perspective changes everything. It turns our usual anxieties on their heads. Instead of looking forward with dread toward the grave, Cioran asks us to look back at the cradle with a sense of profound mourning. It is a strange way to start a journey, isn't it? Most philosophers try to give us a reason to live, a why to sustain the how. But Cioran is different. He isn't interested in comfort. He is interested in the raw, unvarnished truth of the fatigue that comes with being a person. He captures that feeling we all have on those quiet, heavy Tuesday afternoons, when the simple act of breathing feels like a monumental task. He calls birth an incurable accident. If you were never born, you wouldn't have to suffer, you wouldn't have to strive, and you wouldn't have to witness the slow decay of your own ideals. There is a certain dark liberation in this thought. If the worst thing that could possibly happen to you, being born, has already occurred, then everything else, even death, is just a minor detail, a rounding error in the grand calculation of nothingness. Cioran's writing feels less like a formal lecture and more like a late-night conversation with a friend who has seen too much but still finds a way to be elegantly cynical about it. He writes in fragments, because life itself is fragmented. We don't experience a cohesive, logical narrative, we experience bursts of joy, long stretches of boredom, and sudden stabs of regret. He reflects on the idea that we are all just time-bound creatures trying to act as if we are eternal. We build monuments, we write books, we start families, etc., all to distract ourselves from the fact that we are moving toward a finish line that was drawn the moment we inhaled for the first time. He often talks about the loss of the centre. In the old days, people had a fixed point, God, or the king, or the tribe. Today, the centre is everywhere and nowhere. Each of us is a centre of our own universe, which means there are 8 billion centres all clashing against one another, creating a chaotic symphony of ego. He pushes us to consider the concept of doing versus being. In our modern world, we are obsessed with doing. We have to be productive, we have to achieve, we have to leave a mark. Cioran suggests that this is just a frantic attempt to justify our accidental existence. We work because we are afraid to sit still and realise that there is nothing at the core. He famously noted that we do not run toward death. We flee from the catastrophe of birth, and in that flight, we create civilizations, religions, and wars. All of human history is just a giant, elaborate thank you, or no thank you, to the fact of our existence. He looks at the saints and the hermits, the people who tried to step out of time, and he finds them fascinating because they at least recognize the problem. They knew that to be in time is to be in a state of constant loss. Every second that passes is a second of our life that is gone forever. We are being consumed by the very thing that defines us. As we dive deeper into this landscape of thought, we encounter Cioran's reflections on the sheer absurdity of the human condition. He often points out that we are the only animals who find our own existence problematic. A cat doesn't wake up and wonder if it's worth it to be a cat. A tree doesn't feel the sting of existential dread as its leaves turn brown. But we, with our overdeveloped brains, have turned living into a debate. We have to convince ourselves every morning that the light is better than the dark. Cioran argues that this consciousness is actually a form of disease. To be aware is to be divided. We are the observer and the observed, the prisoner and the guard. This duality is what creates our suffering. If we were just being, like a stone or a star, we would be at peace. But because we are beings, we are constantly trying to bridge the gap between what we are and what we think we should be. He touches upon the idea of insomnia, a theme he knew all too well. For Cioran, the man who sleeps is a man who still belongs to the world. Sleep is a temporary return to the womb, a brief ceasefire in the war of existence. But the insomniac, the person who stares at the ceiling at 3 o'clock in the morning, is the one who truly sees the world for what it is. In the silence of the night, all the distractions of the day vanish. There are no chores, no social roles, no ambitions to hide behind. There is only the ticking of the clock and the terrifying vastness of eternity. In those hours, the trouble with being born becomes visceral. You realize that you are a consciousness trapped in a body, and that body is slowly, surely failing. The year 1911, when he was born, marks the beginning of his own personal countdown, and he never lets the reader forget that every year since then has been a step away from the only true perfection, the void. There is a strange beauty in his pessimism. It isn't the kind of pessimism that makes you want to give up. It's the kind that makes you want to stop pretending. He suggests that if we accept that life is a tragedy, we can finally stop being disappointed. If you expect the world to be a garden, you'll be angry every time you find a thorn. But if you accept that the world is a wasteland, then every small flower you find becomes a miracle. He speaks of the vanity of action. Why do we strive so hard? If you look at the stars, our greatest achievements are less than a speck of dust. In 1,000,000 years, or even 1,000, no one will remember your name or your struggles. Cioran doesn't say this to be cruel, he says it to offer a form of negative grace. When you realize that nothing matters on a cosmic scale, the pressure to be someone disappears. You can just be. He also explores the relationship between silence and words. As a writer, Cioran was a master of the aphorism, the short, sharp sentence that hits like a hammer. He believed that the more we talk, the more we lie to ourselves. Language is a tool for concealment. We use words to fill the emptiness, to build a wall between us and the terrifying silence of the universe. But the more we build that wall, the more isolated we become. He envied the mystics who could sit in silence for years, because they had reached a point where they no longer needed to justify themselves to anyone, not even to God. To Cioran, the ultimate goal is to reach a state where you no longer feel the need to be. He calls it the state of the unborn. It is a mental return to that pre-catastrophic peace, where there were no desires, no pains, and no questions. This brings us to his view on God. He doesn't see God as a benevolent creator, but rather as the first victim of the urge to create. If God exists, he must be the most miserable being of all, because he is responsible for all of this. He is the one who started the fire. Cioran's theology is one of protest. He doesn't deny the divine, he just finds it guilty. He suggests that we are all, in a way, more noble than the creator, because we have to endure the flaws of the creation, while he just watches from the sidelines. This reversal of the traditional religious hierarchy is typical of his style. He takes the concepts we are taught to revere, birth, progress, divinity, and shows us their shadows. He makes us realize that our existence is a debt we never asked to incur, and we spend our entire lives trying to pay the interest on a loan that bought us something we never really wanted. As we navigate through these reflections, we come to a point where Emil Cioran examines the concept of belonging to the world. He suggests that most of us are sleepwalkers, moving through life with a borrowed identity. We take on the names, the religions, and the national pride that were handed to us at birth, rarely stopping to ask if these things have any inherent reality. To Cioran, the person who truly wakes up is the one who realizes they are a stranger to everything, including their own skin. He often wrote about the feeling of being outside of life, looking in through a glass wall. This detachment isn't a choice. It is a consequence of seeing too clearly. When you recognize that your birth was an accident, the social structures around you start to look like elaborate stage sets. You see the actors wearing their masks of importance, but you can't help but notice the wooden supports holding up the scenery. He delves into the idea that we are victims of our own vitality. We are pushed forward by an id or a biological force that doesn't care about our individual happiness. This force wants us to survive, to reproduce, and to keep the wheel of suffering turning. Cioran views this as a cruel joke played by nature on consciousness. He notes that the more intelligent a man becomes, the more he tries to sabotage this biological drive. He looks at the ascetic, the monk, or the person who chooses not to have children as someone who is performing an act of ultimate rebellion. By refusing to pass on the trouble of being born, they are effectively telling the universe that they refuse to participate in its meaningless expansion. For him, the decision to leave the chain of existence unbroken is perhaps the only noble act left to a human being. It is a way of reclaiming a small piece of territory from the tyranny of time. Cioran also reflects on the burden of memory and the way it anchors us to our mistakes. We are the only creatures who carry our past around like a heavy suitcase. A dog doesn't regret what it did 2 years ago, but a human can be paralysed by a single memory from 20 years in the past. He argues that if we could live in a perpetual present, without the shadow of the past or the anxiety of the future, we might actually find a way to endure existence. But our brains are built for regret. We look back at the versions of ourselves that no longer exist and mourn them as if they were dead friends. This internal fragmentation, being a collection of past selves that we no longer recognise, is another layer of the disaster that began at birth. We are not a single I, but a ghost story told by a series of strangers who happen to share our name. He invites us to think about the pleasure of the void. There is a certain comfort in knowing that everything is doomed. When you stop trying to save the world or even yourself, you reach a state of dark tranquility. He calls this the wisdom of the abyss. It is the realization that since nothing can truly be achieved, there is no such thing as failure. You are free to fail, free to be nothing, because nothingness is where you came from and where you are going. This perspective turns our modern obsession with self-improvement on its head. Why improve a shadow? Why polish a mirror that reflects only emptiness? Cioran's philosophy is a long, elegant sigh of relief. It is the sound of someone putting down a weight they have been carrying for 30 or 40 or 50 years. Continuing this thread, we find Cioran exploring the paradox of writing itself. Why would a man who believes life is a catastrophe bother to write books about it? He admits that writing is a form of therapy, but a deceptive one. It is a way of vomiting his bile so that he doesn't choke on it. By turning his suffering into beautiful prose, he makes it manageable. But he warns us not to mistake the beauty of the words for the reality of the condition. He notes that the writer is a professional liar who sells his despair for applause. There is a deep self-irony in his work. He mocks his own need for expression. He says that a true philosopher should be silent, but because he is human and flawed, he speaks. Every book he published was a betrayal of his own insight into the superiority of silence. He talks about the illusion of progress. We think that because we have better technology or more complex laws, we are somehow better than the people who lived 2,000 years ago. Cioran disagrees. He believes that the human heart hasn't changed since the first man realized he was going to die. We have only found more sophisticated ways to hide our dread. We build skyscrapers to feel tall, and we create the internet to feel connected, but at 3 o'clock in the morning the fear is exactly the same as it was in a cave. He views history not as a ladder, but as a circle, or worse, a spiral downward. The more we try to fix the world, the more we complicate the tragedy. Every solution creates 10 new problems. He looks at the French Revolution or the Industrial Revolution and sees them not as triumphs, but as frenzied outbursts of a species that can't stand to be alone with its own boredom. Boredom, for Cioran, is a sacred state. Most people run from it because it forces them to face the emptiness of their lives. We fill our days with noise, work, and entertainment to avoid the horror of a quiet room. But Cioran argues that in boredom, we find the true texture of time. When you are bored, time slows down. You feel every second passing like a drop of water hitting your forehead. In that state, you're closer to the truth than when you're busy. You're experiencing the raw, unadorned fact of your existence. He suggests that if we could all just be bored together, we might stop killing each other. War is often just a cure for boredom, a way to feel alive by bringing ourselves closer to death. If we accepted the dullness of being, we would find a strange, stagnant peace. He also examines the nature of the enemy. In his view, the real enemy is not other people, but our own attachment to life. We are addicted to being. Even the most miserable person clings to their life with a desperate, irrational hunger. He finds this both pathetic and fascinating. He tells the story of people in the worst conditions imaginable, the sick, the imprisoned, the starving who still fear death. This biological will is a master puppeteer, and we are its dancing dolls. Cioran's work is an attempt to cut the strings. He wants us to see the puppeteer, to see the absurdity of our movements, and to perhaps, for a fleeting moment, stop dancing. He doesn't offer a new way to live, he offers a way to stop being deceived by the life you're already living. This leads him to a profound reflection on the unborn once again. He imagines the millions of potential people who were never conceived, and he considers them the lucky ones. They are the true elite of the universe. They never had to taste salt, never had to feel a broken heart, and never had to face the decline of their bodies. They remain in that perfect, unmanifested state that we lost the moment our parents met. Cioran's philosophy is a long, poetic apology to his own non-existence. He feels he has sinned by being born, and his life is a long penance for that original crime. He isn't looking for a heaven in the future, he's looking for the nothingness he left behind in the past. He wants to go back to the source, to the place where there are no words, no years, and no trouble. As we follow Cioran deeper into the forest of his thoughts, he begins to examine the architecture of our social identities and the inherent falseness of civilization. He suggests that we are all essentially deserters from our own nature. Civilization is nothing more than an organized conspiracy to make us forget the void that surrounds us. We invent complex legal systems, etiquette, and social hierarchies to give our accidental lives a sense of structure and purpose. Cioran observes that the more civilized a society becomes, the more it suffers from a specific kind of spiritual exhaustion. He notes that the barbarian, who lives closer to the raw reality of survival, doesn't have the luxury of existential dread. But we, in our climate-controlled rooms and digital networks, have created enough space to finally notice how hollow the foundation is. We are like people living on the top floor of a skyscraper that has no ground level. He reflects on the year 1973, a time when he was looking back at the wreckage of the 20th century. He saw the great ideologies, the isms that promised a better world, as nothing more than different flavours of madness. Whether it is political revolution or religious fervour, Cioran views these movements as desperate attempts to escape the trouble of being a person. We want to belong to something larger than ourselves because we cannot stand the smallness of our own reality. But every time we join a cause, we simply trade our individual despair for a collective delusion. He points out that the most dangerous people in history are those who believe they have a mission. The man who knows he is nothing is harmless, but the man who thinks he is the instrument of God or history is a threat to everyone. To Cioran, the only path to a sort of sane existence is to resign from all missions and embrace your own insignificance. He also touches upon the relationship between illness and insight. Cioran believed that health is a veil that keeps us from seeing the truth. When we are healthy, we feel invincible and eternal. We are fooled by our bodies into believing that life is a continuous positive progression. But when we fall ill, the veil is torn. Pain is the great educator. It forces us to realize that we are biological machines that are slowly breaking down. In the throes of a fever or a chronic ache, the abstractions of philosophy disappear, and we are left with the undeniable fact of our vulnerability. He suggests that a person who has never been sick can never truly be a philosopher, because they haven't experienced the fragility of the I. Illness is a preview of the non-existence we are all heading toward, a reminder that our lease on being is temporary and subject to immediate eviction. Continuing this exploration of our internal decay, Cioran turns his gaze toward the concept of the ego. He describes the ego as a parasite that feeds on our vitality. We spend so much energy defending our reputation, our brand, and our sense of self-importance, yet this self is a fluid, changing thing that barely exists from one moment to the next. He finds it hilarious and tragic that we are willing to die for an image in a mirror. He suggests that the greatest liberation comes when you finally give up on yourself. When you no longer care if you're successful or respected, you become untouchable. The world can no longer hurt a man who has already agreed with the world that he is nothing. This is not a depressing thought for Cioran, it is a profound relief. It is the ultimate no to the pressures of society. He dives into the idea of the end of history. While many thinkers of his era were debating the future of humanity, Cioran was more interested in the sunset of our species. He didn't see the future as a place of technological wonder, but as a slow fading out. He felt that humanity was a tired species, one that had exhausted its creative energy and was now just going through the motions. He often compared our current state to the late Roman Empire, a time of immense decadence, endless distraction, and a deep underlying sense that the party was over. He wasn't mourning this, he saw it as an inevitable biological cycle. Everything that is born must decline and disappear, and that includes entire civilizations. The trouble with being born applies to empires as much as it does to individuals. He speaks of the lucidity of the damned. There are those who, by virtue of their suffering or their isolation, see the world without any filters. They are damned because they can no longer enjoy the simple illusions that make life tolerable for others. They cannot be moved by a patriotic song, a political promise, or even a romantic gesture, because they see the nothing behind it. But in this damnation there is a terrible honesty. They are the only ones who aren't lying. Cioran identifies with these outsiders, the ones who stand on the periphery of life and watch the parade of the living with a mixture of pity and contempt. He believes that the only true dignity is to face the void without blinking, to acknowledge the trouble of your birth and still find the strength to compose a perfect sentence about it. Finally, he reflects on the silence of the stars. He looks up at the night sky and sees a universe that is completely indifferent to human drama. Whether we thrive or perish, whether we find meaning or stay lost in the dark, the stars will continue their silent, cold movements for billions of years. This cosmic indifference is the ultimate antidote to human ego. It reminds us that our troubles are local, temporary, and ultimately sudden in the grand scale of reality. For Cioran, the goal of life is to align oneself with that kingdom, to become as quiet and as indifferent as the void itself. He spent his life writing words to reach a place where words are no longer necessary. He lived his life as a long, slow departure, a gradual fading back into the non-existence that he always felt was his true home. Expanding on the idea of cosmic indifference, we must look at how Cioran views the passing of time as a relentless erosion of the self. In the world of the living, we often celebrate birthdays as milestones of growth, but in the eyes of the philosopher, each year is simply a year further away from our only period of perfection, the time before we existed. He reflects on how we are constantly being evicted from the present moment. We try to catch our breath, to find a place of stillness, but the clock never stops. Cioran suggests that this is the true source of our fatigue. It isn't just physical tiredness, it is the exhaustion of being a tenant of time. We are forced to occupy a space that is constantly shifting, constantly demanding that we adapt to a new now that immediately becomes a then. He brings up the year 1974, a period where his thoughts turn toward the vanity of intellectual pursuits. We often think that by learning more, by accumulating knowledge, we are somehow mastering life. But Cioran argues that the more we know, the more we realize how little we can actually change. Knowledge doesn't set us free, it just gives us a better view of our cage. He looks at the great libraries of the world not as treasure houses of wisdom, but as cemeteries of dead thoughts. Each book is a testament to someone who thought they had found a way to explain the unexplainable. To him, the only true philosophy is the one that admits its own failure from the start. A man who truly knows the world is a man who has run out of things to say. He has reached the wall of silence and is content to lean against it. This leads us to his startling observations on the purity of animals. He notes that animals are saved by their lack of a future. A bird doesn't worry about being a bird tomorrow. It exists in a state of grace because it is identical with its own life. Humans, however, are always ahead of themselves. We are dreaming of a future that hasn't happened, or mourning a past that is gone. This mental time travel is the primary source of our misery. Cioran suggests that if we could somehow amputate our imagination, we might finally find a way to live. But we are cursed with the ability to see the end while we are still at the beginning. We see the skeleton inside the lover, and we see the ruin inside the city. This double vision, seeing the thing and its decay simultaneously, is the price we pay for the consciousness that began at our birth. Building on this sense of double vision, we encounter Cioran's fascination with the concept of the void. For him, the void is not a scary dark place, it is the ultimate destination of all our wandering. He suggests that throughout our lives, we feel a strange homesickness for the state of non-being. It is that feeling of being out of place at a party, or the sudden sense of unreality that hits you when you look in a mirror for too long. We feel like we don't belong here because, in a fundamental sense, we don't. We were drafted into existence without our consent, and our souls, or whatever you wish to call that core of consciousness, never quite forgive the world for the intrusion. He views our moments of profound sadness as leaks from the void, reminders of the peace we left behind. He explores the year 1975 through the lens of human pride. He notes that we are a species that loves to talk about destiny and legacy. We want to believe that our lives have a specific meaning in the grand design of the universe. Cioran finds this deeply humorous. He suggests that if we really want to see our place in the universe, we should look at the billions of years that passed before we arrived, and the billions that will pass after we leave. Our time is a blink of an eye, a momentary glitch in the silence. He argues that the most honest way to live is to treat life like a hobby rather than a mission. Don't take your triumphs too seriously, and certainly don't take your failures to heart. If nothing matters, then you are finally free to enjoy the absurdity of it all. This brings him to the idea of the Sisyphus of the spirit. Like the mythical figure condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, we are condemned to push the weight of our own existence through the days. But Cioran offers a twist. The boulder is only heavy because we think it has to reach the top. If we accept that the boulder will always roll back down, and that the top doesn't even exist, the task becomes lighter. We can push it with a smile, or we can sit down and watch it roll. He calls for a total surrender to the meaninglessness of life. It is only when we stop looking for meaning that we stop being tortured by its absence. He wants us to become connoisseurs of the abyss, people who can stare into the dark and appreciate its depth without feeling the need to fill it with light. He concludes these thoughts by reflecting on the ultimate trouble of being born, the fact that we can never truly unknow what we have seen. Once you have realized the catastrophe of existence, you can't go back to being a happy sleepwalker. You're awake and the room is empty, but in that emptiness there is a strange, cold dignity. You're no longer a victim of hope. You're no longer waiting for a savior or a revolution to fix things. You are just a guest in a universe that doesn't know you're there. And for Cioran, that is enough. You have lived through the trouble, you have documented the disaster, and now you are ready to return to the silence that has been waiting for you since before the world began. Moving deeper into the labyrinth of Emil Cioran's mind, we encounter his sharp critique of the human obsession with purpose and vocation. He observes that from the moment we are born, society begins the process of moulding us into useful tools, assigning us roles that we are expected to play until the day we die. Cioran suggests that this is just another way to distract ourselves from the fundamental lack of a why in our lives. We become doctors, lawyers, or labourers because we are terrified of the alternative, being nothing. He argues that a truly free man is one who has no career, one who exists in a state of perpetual availability to the void. For him, the trouble is compounded by our desire to be useful. If we were never born, we wouldn't have to justify our space on this planet through labour or achievement. He reflects on the year 1976, a time when he felt the weight of his own words becoming a burden. He often wondered if his writing was just another form of doing, a way to avoid the purity of simply being. He looked at the vast history of human effort, the wars fought for patches of land, the cathedrals built to appease silent gods, and saw it all as a frantic collective panic attack. We act because we cannot bear to sit in a room alone and acknowledge that our arrival was a biological whim. Cioran suggests that the most radical thing a person can do is to stop. Stop striving, stop hoping, and stop pretending that your specific life has a predetermined script. Only in this total cessation of effort can we glimpse the peace that preceded our birth. He also explores the cruelty of hope. Most people view hope as a virtue, a light in the dark, but Cioran sees it as a chain that keeps us tethered to the treadmill of existence. Hope is the fuel that keeps the disaster going. It is what makes us get up in the morning and face another day of boredom and decay. He argues that the truly brave person is the one who has abandoned hope. Once you stop hoping for a better future, a better world, or a better self, you are finally immune to disappointment. You reach a state of unshakable despair, which is far more stable than the flickering light of hope. In this darkness, you find a consistency that the happy person can never know. You are no longer waiting for anything, which means you can finally be present in the wreckage. Building on this theme of abandonment, Cioran turns his attention to the concept of the flesh. He views the body not as a temple, but as a cage that forces us to participate in the physical world. Our hunger, our thirst, and our desires are the bars of this cage. He notes that we spend the first half of our lives obsessed with the appetites of the flesh, and the second half watching it slowly rot. This biological decay is the ultimate proof that we were never meant to be permanent. The trouble is that we are a spirit, a consciousness capable of imagining eternity, trapped inside a piece of meat that has an expiration date. This mismatch between our mental capacity and our physical reality is a central feature of the human tragedy. He reflects on the year 1977, contemplating the silence of the cemetery. He often walked among the graves, feeling a strange envy for the residents there. They had successfully completed the penance of living. They were no longer bothered by the need to have an opinion, to make a living, or to fear the future. They had returned to the state of the unborn, the only difference being that they left behind a trail of grief and dust. Cioran suggests that we should treat the dead not with pity, but with a certain reverence for their escape. They are the victors who have finally crossed the finish line of a race they never asked to run. He finds it absurd that we cry at funerals but celebrate at births. If we were logical, we would do the opposite. Mourn the newcomer who's about to face decades of trouble, and cheer for the one who is finally done with it all. This leads him to a meditation on the gift of suicide. Cioran famously said that without the idea of suicide, he would have killed himself long ago. It sounds like a paradox, but for him, the possibility of an exit is what makes the room tolerable. When you know you can leave whenever you want, you no longer feel like a prisoner. You are a guest who chooses to stay. This sense of agency, the power to say no to existence, is the only real freedom we have. He doesn't advocate for the act itself, he advocates for the thought of it. The thought of suicide is a tonic that helps us endure the trouble of being born. It is a way of keeping the universe at arm's length, a reminder that we are not entirely at the mercy of the biological urge to survive. He concludes this section of his life by reflecting on the insignificance of the individual. We spend our lives building an I, a personality, a story. But Cioran points out that the universe is indifferent to our I. 1,000 years from now, your name, your loves, and your deepest sorrows will be less than nothing. Even the stars we see in the sky are often already dead, their light just a lingering echo of a past catastrophe. We are echoes of echoes. When we accept this insignificance, the trouble of being born loses its sting. We realize that we are just a brief flicker of consciousness in an eternal night, and in that realization there is a profound, icy peace. We are no longer required to be anything. We can just drift through our remaining days, watching the shadows grow longer, waiting for the return of the silence that was there at the start. Continuing our journey through the dense thickets of Emil Cioran's thought, we encounter his profound fascination with the concept of the failure of language. He believed that words are fundamentally incapable of capturing the weight of the trouble we feel. At the moment of birth, we are thrust into a world where we must use symbols to describe sensations that are essentially wordless. Cioran suggests that every time we speak, we are simplifying our despair, turning a vast oceanic feeling into a series of shallow puddles. He reflects on how we use conversation as a social lubricant to avoid the friction of our own existence. If we truly spoke the truth, every conversation would end in a collective scream or an eternal silence. Instead, we talk about the weather, politics, or our trivial plans, acting as though the ground beneath us isn't constantly shifting. He looks back at the year 1978 and considers the vanity of the philosopher who thinks they have explained the world. To Cioran, a system of philosophy is just a more organised form of a lie. He argues that the only honest writing is the scream or the sigh, but because we are cultured, we turn those screams into books. There is a deep, biting irony in his realization that he is contributing to the very noise he despises. He describes his own work as a form of elegant suicide, where he kills his feelings by turning them into sentences. He notes that once a thought is written down, it loses its power to haunt you. It becomes a specimen in a museum. This leads him to believe that the truly wise are those who never wrote a word, the ones who kept their insights buried deep within their own silence, refusing to participate in the marketplace of ideas. He also explores the idea of the ancestral burden. He suggests that we are not just born as individuals, but as the culmination of thousands of years of suffering. We carry the ghosts of our ancestors' fears, their failures, and their unfulfilled desires. When you wake up with a sense of dread that you cannot explain, Cioran argues that it might not even be your dread. It is the accumulated weight of humanity's history pressing down on a single heart. He views birth not as a fresh start, but as the resumption of an old, tired story. We are forced to pick up the script where the previous generation left off, condemned to repeat the same biological and psychological patterns. This historical fatigue is a central part of the trouble. We are exhausted by the lives of people we never even knew. Building on this sense of exhaustion, Cioran turns his attention to the tyranny of the future. He observes that humanity is unique in its ability to be tortured by things that haven't happened yet. We spend our entire lives preparing for a tomorrow that is always out of reach. We save money, we build reputations, and we plan for a retirement that our decaying bodies may never even enjoy. He reflects on the year 1979 as a point where he saw this cultural obsession with progress as a form of mass hysteria. We are so focused on where we are going that we forget that the destination is always the grave. To Cioran, the only way to truly live is to abandon the future entirely. If you have no goals, you have no anxiety. He dives into the concept of the Great Disconnection. This is the moment when a person realizes that they are fundamentally alone in the universe. No matter how many friends you have or how much your family loves you, the trouble of your existence is yours alone to carry. He notes that we are born alone and we die alone, and the time in between is just a series of failed attempts to bridge that gap. He finds a strange cold comfort in this isolation. When you realize that no one can truly understand you, you stop trying to explain yourself. You stop looking for validation from a world that doesn't care. This radical independence is the only true form of sovereignty. You become a king of your own void, a ruler of a kingdom of one. This leads him to a meditation on the aesthetics of disappearance. Cioran suggests that our lives should be a process of slowly erasing ourselves. Instead of trying to become greater, we should try to become less. He admires the way a mist dissolves into the air or the way a footprint is washed away by the tide. He argues that we should aim for a state of unbirth, where we slowly retract our interest in the world until there is nothing left. He looks at the elderly not with pity, but as people who are closer to the truth because they have lost their illusions. They are fading out, and in that fading there is a certain grace. They are finally becoming as light as the air, preparing to return to the nothingness that is our only true heritage. He concludes this portion of his reflections by considering the relief of finality. We often fear the end, but Cioran asks us to consider how terrifying it would be if life never ended. Imagine the trouble of being born stretched out over an eternity. Death is the only thing that makes life bearable because it provides a limit to our suffering. It is the ultimate out, the final closure on an accidental existence. He views death not as an enemy to be fought, but as a friend who waits at the end of a very long, very tiring day to take our coat and lead us into the dark. In the year 1980, he felt this friendship more than ever. The trouble with being born is a heavy burden, but the promise of being gone is the light at the end of the tunnel. Stepping further into the special gloom of Emil Cioran's philosophy, we must confront his deep-seated skepticism regarding the illusion of choice. We are raised to believe that we are the masters of our fate, that every decision we make is a stroke of our own free will. However, Cioran suggests that our paths were largely determined the moment our biological clock began to tick. The trouble is that we are born with a specific temperament, a set of predispositions, and a pre-packaged history that we can never truly escape. He views our choices not as acts of freedom, but as the inevitable reactions of a machine to its environment. In his eyes, the idea of the self-made man is the ultimate vanity. We are made by the collision of two cells in the year 1911, and everything after that is just the unfolding of a map that was drawn long before we could even speak. He reflects on the year 1981, observing the frantic energy of the youth. He sees in their passion and their protests a tragic misunderstanding of the world. They believe they can change the system, but Cioran argues that the system is life itself. You cannot reform a disaster, you can only endure it. He finds it painful to watch new generations invest their spirit into ideologies that will inevitably fail them. To him, the only honest education would be to teach children the art of resignation from day one. Instead of telling them they can be anything, we should tell them that they already are what they will always be, temporary residents of a dying planet. This sounds harsh, but for Cioran, it is a form of mercy. If you never believe in the promise of the future, you are never betrayed by its failure. He also explores the comedy of ambition. We spend our lives climbing ladders, seeking titles, and striving for a legacy. Cioran points out that even the most successful person is just a corpse in waiting. He imagines the great emperors and conquerors of history and notes that they are now just names in dusty books that no one reads. Their ambition was a fever that burned for a few decades and then vanished into the cold silence of the earth. He suggests that the man who spends his life doing nothing, the professional idler, is actually closer to the truth than the busy executive. The idler has realized that the result of all action is zero. Why move when the destination remains the same? This paralysis of insight is a hallmark of Cioran's late thought. He advocates for a life lived in the margins, where the noise of the world is reduced to a distant, meaningless hum. Building on this advocacy for stillness, Cioran turns his gaze towards the curse of consciousness. He often remarked that the human being is a thinking animal. that has thought itself into a corner. Our ability to reflect on our own existence is what separates us from the bliss of the natural world, but it is also what makes us miserable. He suggests that if we could return to a state of pure instinct, we would find the peace that we lost at birth. But we are condemned to know. We know that we are aging, we know that our loved ones will die, and we know that the universe is indifferent to our prayers. This knowledge is a poison that we drink every day. The trouble is that there is no antidote. You cannot unknow the truth once you have seen it. In the year 1982, he spent a great deal of time reflecting on the aesthetics of boredom. While most people see boredom as a state to be avoided at all costs, Cioran saw it as a spiritual achievement. When you are truly bored, you are stripped of your social masks. You are not a citizen, a worker, or a father. You are just a consciousness existing in time. He believed that in these moments of pure, unadulterated dullness, we come closest to the state of the unborn. Boredom is a bridge back to the void. It is the feeling of time passing without the distraction of meaning. He suggests that we should cultivate this state, learning to sit with the emptiness until it no longer feels like a threat, but like a familiar companion. This leads him to a meditation on the dignity of the outsider. Cioran felt that the only way to maintain one's integrity in a world built on lies was to remain an eternal stranger. He rejected all forms of belonging, nationalism, religion, even the belonging to a family. To belong is to accept a set of blinders. He preferred the cold, clear air of isolation. He notes that the outsider sees the theatre of life for what it truly is, a collection of actors who have forgotten they are wearing costumes. By refusing to join the play, the outsider maintains a perspective that is honest, if lonely. For Cioran, the loneliness is not a problem to be solved, but a badge of honour. It is the proof that you have not been fooled by the mirage of society. He concludes this phase of his life by considering the final surrender. As he aged, the fire of his cynicism didn't go out. It became a steady, quiet glow. He realised that the trouble of being born is a debt that can never be fully repaid until the moment of death. Life is a long process of liquidation, where we slowly sell off our hopes, our health, and our memories. But in this process, there is a strange lightness. The less you have, the less you have to lose. He looks towards the end not with fear, but with the quiet anticipation of a traveller who is finally reaching home after a very long and confusing journey. The void that he mourned at his birth is the same void that welcomes him back, and in that circularity, he finds the only justice the universe has to offer. As we move forward into the deeper reflections of Emil Cioran, we encounter his piercing look at the concept of the paralysis of the will. He suggests that the more one contemplates the trouble of existence, the more one finds it impossible to participate in the typical strivings of a human life. We are taught that ambition is the engine of progress, yet Cioran views it as a fever that blinds us to the ultimate futility of our actions. He reflects on how we are born with a biological momentum that forces us to act, to build and to conquer, but true wisdom lies in the ability to stand still. He notes that the man who has truly realised the catastrophe of his birth finds that he has no reason to move from his chair. If the destination of every journey is the same silence from which we emerged, then every step taken is merely a delay of the inevitable. He looks back at the year 1983, observing a world increasingly obsessed with speed and productivity. To Cioran, this acceleration is a symptom of a deepening panic. We run faster and faster because we are afraid that if we stop, the void will catch up to us. He argues that we should embrace the slowness of the soul. He finds a strange dignity in the person who refuses to get ahead, the one who is content to be a bystander in the theatre of history. This resignation is not a sign of weakness, but of a profound, clear-eyed strength. It is the refusal to be fooled by the mirage of accomplishment. By doing nothing, we refuse to add to the noise of a universe that is already shouting. This holy idleness is, for him, a way of returning to the stillness of the unborn. This leads us to his thoughts on the tyranny of hope. We are often told that hope is what keeps us alive, but Cioran argues that it is exactly what keeps us suffering. Hope is the hook that drags us through the days, making us endure the unendurable in the name of a better tomorrow. He suggests that the only way to find true peace is to reach a state of unshakable despair. When you have finally given up on hope, you're no longer at the mercy of the future. You're no longer waiting for a saviour, a change in luck, or a transformation of the world. You're finally terrifyingly free. In this state, the trouble of being born becomes a static fact, like the colour of your eyes or the shape of the mountains. It no longer requires a solution. It simply requires your presence. Building on this theme of presence, in the midst of despair, Cioran turns his attention to the anatomy of melancholy. He does not see melancholy as a clinical condition to be cured, but as a fundamental insight into the nature of reality. To be melancholy is to feel the weight of time passing, to sense the leakage of your own life into the past. He reflects on the year 1984, considering how our modern world tries to pathologize every form of sadness. We are given pills and therapies to make us functional again, but Cioran argues that this is just another way to silence the truth. He believes that the melancholy person is the only one who is truly awake. They feel the fragility of the world and the hollowness of our social games. He dives into the idea of the cosmic insignificance of the individual. We spend our lives building an I, a story, a legacy, but Cioran points out that the universe does not know our names. 1,000,000 years from now, our greatest tragedies and our most triumphant moments will be less than a whisper in the wind. He finds a profound, icy comfort in this realization. If you are nothing, then you can no longer fail. If your life is an accident, then you are not responsible for its outcome. This perspective strips away the layers of ego and pride that make our existence so heavy. It allows us to view ourselves with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. We are just a brief flicker of light between two vast darknesses, and there is an elegance in that brevity. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of the end. As he approached the final chapters of his own life, Cioran became increasingly fascinated by the way things disappear. He admired the way an old ruin is slowly reclaimed by the forest, or the way a memory gradually fades until it is gone. He suggests that our goal should be to fade out with as much grace as possible. Instead of fighting against the decline of our bodies and the loss of our faculties, we should welcome them as signs that the penance of living is coming to a close. He looks toward death not as a terrifying void, but as the ultimate unbirth. It is the moment when the trouble finally stops, and we are allowed to return to the silence that has been waiting for us for billions of years. He concludes this section of his journey by reflecting on the silence of God. Whether God exists or not is, for Cioran, less important than the fact that he does not speak. This divine silence is the mirror in which we see our own isolation. We shout our questions into the dark, and the dark answers with more darkness. But in that silence we find our own sovereignty. We are the ones who must endure, we are the ones who must witness, and we are the ones who must ultimately depart. The trouble with being born is a heavy burden, but the fact that we can carry it at all, and even find the words to describe its weight, is a testament to a strange, dark nobility. We are the survivors of our own arrival, and soon enough we will be the guests of the eternal night once again. As we proceed, Cioran invites us to contemplate the fatigue of the spirit that accompanies the mere act of having a history. He suggests that the longer we exist, the more we become a collection of used moments, a scrap heap of sensations that have lost their edge. The trouble is that we are forced to drag this heap behind us, pretending that it constitutes a coherent and meaningful life. He reflects on the year 1985, noting how society constantly demands that we reinvent ourselves, as if we could somehow scrub away the stain of our past through a change of scenery or a new set of goals. Cioran argues that this is a futile exercise. You cannot escape the weight of your own being by moving it to a different location. The exhaustion we feel is not from our labour, but from the relentless repetition of being a self, day after day. He delves into the idea that we are all survivors of our own birth. This perspective shifts our relationship with death. Usually we see death as a threat to our continuity, but Cioran sees birth as the primary interruption of our peace. Death, therefore, is not a new catastrophe, but the final correction of the original one. He notes that the man who truly understands this doesn't fear the end. He fears the middles, those long, stagnant stretches of time where we are neither fully alive nor yet return to the void. He observes the year 1986 as a time when he felt the curse of longevity. To live a long life is to witness the slow, systematic dismantling of every illusion you once held. It is to see the friends of your youth turn into strangers and the passions of your prime turn into footnotes. This leads us to his startling observations on the luxury of failure. In a world obsessed with winning, Cioran finds a secret freedom in losing. When you fail, the world stops expecting things from you. You're no longer a participant in the race, you're a spectator. He suggests that the trouble of being born is exacerbated by the pressure to justify that birth through success. If you refuse to succeed, you effectively undo the social contract that was signed on your behalf when you were a child. You reclaim your time and your silence. He argues that we should celebrate our failures as small victories over the biological and social drive to be someone. In the stillness of a life that has gone nowhere, we find a reflection of the perfect, unproductive silence that existed before the world was made. Building on the concept of unproductivity, Cioran turns his attention to the vanity of expression. He often questioned why he continued to write at all, given his conviction that words are merely a sophisticated way of hiding the truth. He reflects on the year 1987, considering the millions of books that are published every year, each one a frantic attempt to grab a moment of attention in an indifferent universe. He describes the writer as a professional masochist who turns his private pain into public spectacle. There is a deep self-deprecating irony in his work. He realizes that by writing about the trouble of being born, he is keeping that trouble alive. To truly follow his own philosophy to its logical conclusion would be to stop writing and disappear into the shadows of a quiet room. He dives into the philosophy of the fragment. Cioran rarely wrote long, systematic treatises because he believed that the universe itself is not a system. It is a collection of broken pieces, accidental collisions, and random bursts of energy. To write a cohesive philosophy is to lie about the nature of reality. Instead, he preferred the aphorism, the sharp, disconnected thought that mirrors the fragmented nature of our experience. He notes that our lives are lived in flashes of insight separated by long periods of dullness. The trouble is that we try to bridge those gaps with stories and logic, creating a fake sense of continuity. He wants us to embrace the gaps, to realize that we are not a solid person, but a series of disappearing moments. This brings him to a meditation on the grace of indifference. As he grew older, Cioran sought a state of mind where nothing could disturb his inner void. He looked at the political upheavals and cultural shifts of the late 20th century with the detached air of a traveller watching a storm from a high mountain. He suggests that the only way to endure the catastrophe of being born is to become dead to the world while you are still in it. This is not a cold or cruel indifference, but a protective one. It is the realization that since nothing can truly be changed, there is no sense in being agitated. He calls for a disinterest in destiny. If you stop caring where the world is going, you can finally notice the specific beauty of a falling leaf or the pattern of dust in a sunbeam. He concludes this portion of his journey by reflecting on the ultimate return. He acknowledges that despite all his complaints and his dark insights, he has lived a life. He has eaten, slept, talked, and written. This biological persistence is the final joke that the body plays on the mind. In the year 1988, he felt the proximity of the end more than ever, not as a tragedy but as a settling of accounts. The trouble with being born is a debt of energy that we eventually pay back to the earth. He looks forward to the moment when his consciousness will finally dissolve, releasing him from the obligation of having an I. The silence that preceded his birth is waiting to reclaim its own, and for Cioran, that return is the only true happy ending possible in a world defined by the disaster of arrival. Continuing our exploration into the shadowed corridors of Emil Cioran's philosophy, we arrive at his deep meditation on the injustice of reality. He suggests that the world is built upon a foundation of fundamental unfairness that begins at the very moment of conception. The trouble is that we are born into a lottery we did not enter, inheriting a physical form, a social status, and a historical moment that define the boundaries of our possible experiences. Cioran reflects on the year 1989, a time of great global shifts, yet he viewed these changes with a characteristic detachment. To him, the rise and fall of political systems were merely ripples on the surface of a deep, stagnant ocean of human suffering. He argues that no revolution can fix the original sin of existence. Whether a man lives in a palace or a hovel, he still carries the burden of a consciousness that knows it is doomed. He delves into the idea that to be is to be guilty. For Cioran, existence itself is a form of transgression against the purity of the void. By occupying space and consuming time, we are asserting ourselves at the expense of the silence that should have remained undisturbed. He notes that we spend our lives trying to justify this intrusion through moral systems and religious dogmas, but deep down, we feel the weight of our own illegitimacy. He observes the year 1990 as a period when he felt the heaviness of the soul. It is the feeling that every breath taken is a debt that can never be repaid. He suggests that the only way to alleviate this guilt is to acknowledge the accidental nature of our birth. If we accept that we are here by chance, we can stop trying to act as though we have a divine right to exist. This humility is the only true redemption available to a being that was never meant to be. This leads us to his observations on the cruelty of memory. Cioran views memory not as a treasure chest, but as a torture chamber. We are forced to carry within us every version of ourselves that has already died, the child we once were, the lover we no longer are, the hopeful youth who has been replaced by the cynic. This internal graveyard is a constant source of existential vertigo. He argues that if we could truly forget everything that has happened to us, we might finally find the peace of the present moment. But birth tethered us to a timeline, and memory ensures that we never lose the thread of our own decay. In the silence of his late years, he sought to reach a state of holy amnesia, where the trouble of the past could no longer reach him. He wanted to become like a mirror, reflecting everything but retaining nothing. Building on this desire for emptiness, Cioran turns his attention to the comedy of knowledge. He often mocked the idea that the human mind could ever truly understand the universe. To him, science and philosophy are just elaborate games we play to keep from screaming into the dark. He reflects on the year 1991, looking at the technological advancements of the era as nothing more than sophisticated toys for a dying species. He suggests that the more we explain the world, the more we lose touch with the raw mystery of being. We have turned the universe into a series of equations and data points, forgetting that it is a vast, indifferent abyss that does not care about our discoveries. The trouble of being born is that we are endowed with a curiosity that can never be satisfied, and a logic that eventually leads to its own destruction. He dives into the concept of the sovereignty of the sick. Cioran believed that the healthy man is a sleepwalker who is blinded by his own vitality. Only in the state of physical or mental collapse does the world appear in its true light. He notes that the invalid has a privileged view of the void because he is no longer participating in the delusions of the active life. He is forced to sit still and witness the slow dismantling of his own ego. He observes the year 1992 through the lens of his own increasing fragility. He found that as his body failed, his insights became sharper. The trouble with being born is a physical weight that we only truly notice when we can no longer carry it easily. In the stillness of the sick room, the noise of the world fades, and the silence of the beginning starts to hum in the ears. This leads him to a meditation on the poetry of the end. Cioran suggests that there is a certain beauty in the final stages of a life that has been lived without illusions. He admires the way an old man looks at the world with a mixture of irony and tenderness, knowing that he is about to leave it. He argues that our goal should be to unbecome ourselves with as much style as possible. Instead of clinging to the wreckage of our identity, we should let the tide take it away. He looks toward the final exit not as a loss, but as the ultimate homecoming. The trouble that began with the first breath ends with the last, and the circle is finally closed. He finds an elegance in this finality, a sense that the universe is finally correcting its mistake. He concludes this section of his life by reflecting on the ultimate disappointment. He acknowledges that even death might not be the nothingness we hope for. What if the trouble continues in some other form? This is the final terrifying thought of the cynic, that the disaster of birth might be eternal. However, he settles on the hope that the silence of the earth is deep enough to swallow all our words and all our sorrows. In the year 1993, he felt the proximity of the void as a cooling breeze. The trouble with being born is a long, difficult lesson in the art of letting go. Once you have let go of everything, your name, your work, your memories and your hopes, you are finally ready to return to the state you should never have left. The door is open and the night is waiting. As we venture further into the twilight of Emil Cioran's philosophy, we must address his profound observations on the sovereignty of the void. He suggests that throughout our entire lives, we are merely placeholders for an emptiness that is our true and original state. The trouble is that we treat our personality as a solid fortress when it is actually just a thin layer of frost over an infinite abyss. Cioran reflects on the year 1994, period where his physical existence felt increasingly like a translucent veil. He argues that we spend all our energy decorating our lives with passions and interests, yet these are only frantic attempts to avoid looking directly at the nothingness that sustains us. For him, the most honest realization a human can have is that they are an intruder in the world of the living, a guest who has overstayed their welcome in a house they never intended to visit. He delves into the concept of the failure of progress. We are conditioned to believe that as time moves forward, we are somehow evolving or improving, but Cioran views this as a collective hallucination. He notes that while our tools become more complex, our fundamental despair remains unchanged. A person living in the year 2026 is no closer to solving the trouble of being born than a person living in the year 10,000 before the Common Era. We have simply exchanged the fear of the predator for the anxiety of the digital screen. He argues that progress is just a way of complicating the tragedy of arrival. By adding more layers to civilization, we only make the inevitable fall more spectacular. To Cioran, true wisdom is the ability to see through these temporal illusions and recognize that the human condition is a static disaster, repeating itself in different costumes across the centuries. This leads us to his startling thoughts on the ethics of resignation. In a world that demands we fight for our dreams, Cioran finds a strange purity in surrender. He suggests that the only way to truly defeat the world is to stop wanting anything from it. When you resign from the race for status, wealth, and even health, you become an invisible man. The trouble of being born is magnified by our attachments. If you have no attachments, the universe has no hook to pull you with. He argues that we should practice dying to the world every single day. This is not a call to physical self-destruction, but to a spiritual liquidation. By slowly shedding our desires, we return to the state of the unborn while our hearts are still beating. This is the ultimate rebellion, to exist without participating, to be a ghost in the machinery of life. Building on this theme of spiritual liquidation, Cioran turns his gaze toward the curse of the name. He reflects on how, from the moment of our birth, we are tagged with a label that we must carry to our graves. This name becomes a vessel for expectations, a history, and a social identity that we did not choose. He observes the year 1995, the final year of his own journey, as a time when his name felt like a heavy, ill-fitting coat. He suggests that we would all be better off if we were anonymous, like the wind or the rain. To have a self is to be a target for the arrows of fate. The trouble is that we spend our lives trying to make our name mean something, when the only true meaning is found in the silence of non-existence. He finds it tragic that we cling to our identity even as our bodies are clearly indicating that the show is over. He explores the nostalgia for the uncreated. This is a deep underlying feeling that haunts many of Cioran's fragments, the sense that we left behind a paradise of non-being to enter this world of noise and friction. He argues that our moments of profound, inexplicable sadness are actually messages from that prenatal void. It is a homesickness for a place that has no geography. He notes that the child and the philosopher are often the only ones who can feel this, as they are both closer to the edges of life. The child has recently arrived from the dark, and the philosopher is looking back toward it. This longing is the true trouble of being born, the persistent feeling that we have been exiled from our natural state of nothingness. He suggests that we should treat this nostalgia not as a depression to be cured, but as a compass pointing us back to the source. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of dust. Cioran had a profound appreciation for anything that was crumbling, fading, or returning to the earth. He saw in a pile of dust the ultimate destiny of all our cathedrals and our philosophies. He argues that we should learn to love our own decay, recognizing it as a sign of our eventual liberation. The trouble with being born is a temporary hardening of the spirit. Death is the final softening. He looks toward the end not with the fear of a loser, but with the quiet anticipation of a drop of water about to return to the ocean. In the silence of his final days, the distinction between his life and the void began to blur. He realized that the disaster of his arrival was finally being undone by the grace of his departure. He concludes this section by reflecting on the silence of the final breath. He acknowledges that despite his lifetime of words, the truth is found only when the words stop. The trouble of being born is a long, noisy detour from the silence of eternity. We are given a few decades to shout into the dark, and then the dark gently places a hand over our mouths. He finds an immense, icy beauty in this finality. It is the moment when the debt of existence is finally cleared. As he moved toward his own exit, he felt that the years between 1911 and 1995 were just a brief, difficult dream. The dreamer is waking up, and the dream is dissolving. There is no more trouble, no more years, and no more I. There is only the return to the perfect, unmanifested peace that was there before the world began. To delve further into Cioran's worldview is to encounter his profound critique of the superstition of work. In our contemporary era, we are taught to equate our identity with our profession, believing that through labour we justify our presence on this earth. Cioran, however, sees work as nothing more than a frantic distraction from the fundamental trouble of our existence. He suggests that if we were to stop working, we would be forced to face the silence, and that silence is what we truly fear. He reflects on the year 1911, the year of his own arrival, and notes that the tragedy began long before he ever picked up a pen. The impulse to be productive is, in his eyes, a sign of spiritual panic. We build, we organise, and we optimise because we cannot bear the thought that our lives are a biological accident without a predetermined goal. He invites us to consider the grace of the unsuccessful. In a society that worships the winner, Cioran finds a secret, dark nobility in the failure. The person who has failed in the eyes of the world is often the only one who has managed to escape the machinery of delusion. By failing, one is released from the obligation to maintain a facade of importance. Cioran argues that the trouble of being born is magnified by the burden of expectations. When you are a failure, the world stops expecting things from you, and you are finally free to be nothing. He looks back at the countless civilizations that have risen and fallen, noting that their greatest achievements are now just dust. Why then do we struggle so hard for a temporary victory in a game that has no ultimate prize? To Cioran, the only true success is to have avoided the trap of ambition entirely. This leads to his reflections on the tyranny of the body. He views our physical form as a relentless master that demands constant attention, feeding, cleaning, and resting. We are, quite literally, slaves to our own meat. The body is the vessel of the trouble, the physical anchor that prevents us from returning to the peace of the void. He reflects on how, as we age, the body becomes an even more demanding tyrant, forcing us to witness our own slow disintegration. Cioran suggests that if we were never born, we would be free from this biological drudgery. We would not have to endure the humiliation of physical decay or the constant nagging of our instincts. For him, the body is a prison with a transparent wall. We can see the freedom of non-existence, but we are held back by the persistent beating of our own hearts. Building on this sense of biological imprisonment, Cioran turns his attention to the illusion of originality. He observes every thought we have, every emotion we feel, has likely been felt by millions of people before us. We like to think of ourselves as unique individuals, but we are actually just echoes of a long line of ancestors. He reflects on the year 1988, considering how even our most private sorrows are part of a universal script. The trouble is that we are forced to experience these tired old emotions as if they were brand new. We fall in love, we feel betrayal, and we face death, all while pretending that our experience is significant. Cioran argues that this repetition of the same is the ultimate proof of the futility of human existence. We are like actors in a play that has been running for 1,000,000 years, yet we still tremble as if we don't know the ending. He dives into the aesthetics of the ruin. Cioran had a deep affection for everything that was in a state of collapse: old buildings, dying empires, and fading memories. He saw in the ruin a more honest representation of reality than in the polished new object. A ruin does not try to hide its vulnerability or its inevitable end, it embraces it. He suggests that we should treat our own lives like ruins, allowing ourselves to crumble with a certain style. The trouble with being born is that we try to keep the structure standing long after the foundation has rotted away. Cioran advocates for a philosophy of the sunset, where we find beauty not in growth or progress, but in the slow, graceful fading of the light. He notes that the most beautiful part of the day is the moment just before the dark takes over, and he believes the same is true for a human life. This brings him to a meditation on the gift of apathy. In a world that demands we be passionate about everything, Cioran finds a profound peace in not caring. He suggests that passion is just another way to tether ourselves to the wheel of suffering. When we are passionate, we are vulnerable to disappointment and pain. But when we cultivate a state of indifference, we become untouchable. The trouble of being born is a problem only for those who are invested in life. If you can reach a state of total apathy, the universe loses its power to hurt you. He argues that we should aim for a divine coldness, looking at the tragedies and triumphs of humanity with the same detachment as a scientist looking at a petri dish. For Cioran, this indifference is the only true form of sovereignty available to a being that knows it is doomed. He concludes this portion of his thought by reflecting on the ultimate silence. He acknowledges that even his own words are part of the noise he despises. Every book he wrote was a betrayal of the silence he craved. He reflects on the year 1995, his final year, as a time when he was finally ready to stop speaking. The trouble of being born is a long, difficult lesson in the limits of language. We spend our lives trying to explain our despair, only to realize that the most profound truths are found in the gaps between the words. As he moved toward the end, he felt the proximity of the void as a welcome relief. The noise of his life was finally fading out, and the perfect silence of the beginning was waiting to take its place once again. As we venture further into the intellectual landscape of Emil Cioran, we encounter his piercing analysis of the illusion of social solace. We are taught from our first breath that we are social creatures, that our fulfillment is found in the company of others and the warmth of community. However, Cioran views this as one of the most persistent lies of existence. He suggests that society is merely a collection of lonely individuals who have agreed to lie to one another about the nature of their isolation. The trouble is that we use the presence of others to drown out the internal monologue of our own dread. He reflects on the year 1994 as a time when he saw the increasing connectivity of the world as a deepening of its superficiality. For him, every social gathering is a funeral for the truth. We dress up, we smile, and we speak in platitudes to avoid acknowledging that we are all fundamentally survivors of a biological shipwreck. He delves into the tyranny of vitality. Cioran observes that we are often at the mercy of a mindless life force, a will to live that does not consult our reason or our happiness. This vitality is what forces us to get out of bed, to seek food, and to continue the struggle even when we know it is futile. He argues that consciousness is the enemy of this vitality. The more we think, the more we see that the biological drive to persist is a cruel master. He finds it tragic that we celebrate our health and energy, as these are simply the chains that keep us tethered to the trouble of being born. A man with a lower pulse, a man with less ambition, is closer to the true state of the universe. To Cioran, the ideal state is one of conscious exhaustion, where the mind has finally seen through the tricks of the body and refuses to be moved by its demands. This leads us to his startling observations on the comedy of ethics. Cioran suggests that our moral systems are just elaborate ways to make our accidental existence feel significant. We invent concepts like good and evil to give a narrative structure to a universe that is essentially indifferent. He notes that we spend our lives trying to be virtuous as a way of paying a debt to a creator who isn't there, or to a society that doesn't care. The trouble is that we take these moral games so seriously that we are willing to kill and die for them. Cioran argues for a moral nihilism that is actually more compassionate than traditional ethics. If we realize that no one is right and nothing is earned, we can stop judging one another and simply endure our shared catastrophe with a quiet, ironic solidarity. Building on this sense of shared catastrophe, Cioran turns his gaze toward the curse of the future. He observes that humanity is the only species that lives in a state of perpetual anticipation. We are never truly in the present. We are always becoming something else. He reflects on how, from the year 1911 onward, his own life felt like a series of delays. We wait for school to end, and we wait for a career to start, we wait for the weekend, and finally we wait for the end. The trouble with being born is that it sets us on a track where the only way forward is through the consumption of time. He suggests that if we could truly live in the now without the hope of a then, we would find that the now is empty. It is this emptiness that we are constantly trying to outrun with our plans and our dreams. He dives into the philosophy of the void. Cioran had a profound relationship with the concept of nothingness, viewing it not as a lack, but as the only absolute reality. He argues that all our creations, our art, our religions, our cities, are just foam on the surface of an infinite dark sea. He suggests that we should treat the void as our true home, a place of perfect peace that we were forced to leave at birth. The trouble is that our senses are designed to perceive things, making it difficult for us to appreciate the no thing. He encourages us to cultivate a spiritual transparency where we allow the world to pass through us without leaving a mark. By becoming as light as the void itself, we can finally float above the trouble of our arrival. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of disgust. Cioran often expressed a visceral distaste for the biological processes of life, the sweating, the eating, the aging, and the reproducing. He saw in these functions a constant reminder of our animal nature, which our intellect tries so hard to deny. He argues that this disgust is a form of higher consciousness. It is the part of us that remembers the purity of the unborn and recoils from the messy reality of the born. He notes that the saint and the cynic both share this disgust. They both want to be clean of the world. For Cioran, the only way to reach a state of true dignity is to maintain a certain nausea toward existence. It is this nausea that keeps us from becoming too comfortable in our cage, reminding us that we are just temporary visitors in a house made of flesh. He concludes this portion of his thought by reflecting on the ultimate unimportance. He acknowledges that even his own insights and his most profound despairs are, in the end, irrelevant. The universe does not care if Emil Cioran was born or if he died, and it does not care if we read his books. He finds an immense, icy freedom in this realization. If nothing matters, then even the trouble of being born is just a minor inconvenience in an eternal night. In the year 1995, he looked back at his life not as a tragedy, but as a long, complicated joke that he was finally finishing. The silence was returning, and the trouble was dissolving into the air. He was ready to be forgotten, to return to the state where there are no years, no words, and no I. Deepening our immersion into the philosophy of Emil Cioran, we confront his devastating analysis of the illusion of history. We are often raised to believe that history is a meaningful progression, a story of human struggle leading towards some form of collective enlightenment or resolution. Cioran, however, suggests that history is nothing more than a series of repetitive troubles dressed in different fashions. He reflects on how, from the year 1911 to his final days, he watched the world move through wars, revolutions, and technological shifts, only to find that the fundamental nature of the human catastrophe remained unchanged. He argues that a man born in the year 2026 will face the same existential void as a man from the Middle Ages, despite the complexity of his gadgets. For Cioran, the trouble is that we take the drama of history seriously, failing to see that it's a stage where the actors change but the tragedy stays the same. He delves into the Tyranny of Hope, which he views as a biological trap designed to keep us participating in a game we have already lost. Most philosophies treat hope as a virtue, but Cioran sees it as the primary obstacle to true peace. He suggests that hope is what makes the trouble of being born unendurable, because it forces us to constantly wait for a future that will never arrive. He argues that the only way to find a modicum of stability is to reach a state of perfect disappointment. When you no longer expect anything from life, the universe loses its power to wound you. He reflects on his own year of arrival, 1911, as the start of a journey toward this realization. To Cioran, the man without hope is the only one who is truly free, as he is no longer a slave to the mirage of better days. This leads us to his observations on the comedy of attachment. Cioran observes that we spend our lives building bonds to people, to ideas, and to things, as if these could protect us from the void. He suggests that every attachment is just another weight added to the trouble of being born. We are born alone, and we will depart alone, yet we act as though our social networks and our legacies could somehow grant us a form of immortality. He finds a strange, cold dignity in the person who has managed to detach themselves from everything, even their own name. By becoming a stranger to the world, one returns to the state of the unborn while still in the flesh. To Cioran, the ultimate achievement is to be so disconnected that your own death feels like something happening to a distant acquaintance. Building on this sense of detachment, Cioran turns his gaze toward the curse of intelligence, and he suggests that the more we think, the more we sabotage our own ability to live. Animals are saved by their lack of self-awareness. They exist in a state of grace because they do not know they were born and do not know they will die. But the human being, through the trouble of consciousness, has become an observer of his own decay. He reflects on the year 1995 as a point where he saw human intelligence not as a gift, but as a biological error. We have thought ourselves out of the garden of instinct and into the wasteland of philosophy. He argues that our great ideas are just wreaths we place on the grave of our own vitality. He explores the nostalgia for the abyss. Cioran believes that beneath all our activities lies a deep hidden longing to return to the silence of non-existence. This is the true meaning of boredom and the real root of melancholy. It is the part of us that remembers the perfection of the unborn and finds the world of being to be a noisy, vulgar distraction. He suggests that we should treat our moments of profound sadness as echoes of the void calling us home. He notes that the trouble of being born is a temporary hardening of the spirit, a brief crystallization into an I that is fundamentally out of place. For him, the process of living is just a long, slow melting back into the infinite dark. This brings him to a meditation on the Aesthetics of Disappearance. Cioran had a profound appreciation for everything that was fading, crumbling, or being forgotten. He saw in the ruin a more honest representation of the universe than in the new and the prosperous. He argues that we should aim for a state of transparency, where we move through the world without leaving a footprint or a memory. The trouble is that we want to be important, when the only true greatness is to be as insignificant as a grain of sand or a puff of smoke. He looks toward the end not with the fear of a loser, but with the quiet anticipation of a drop of water returning to the sea. He concludes this phase of his reflections by considering the final silence. He acknowledges that even his own words, the millions of syllables he produced since the year 1911, are part of the noise he despised. Every sentence was a failure, because it could not capture the purity of the nothingness he sought. He finds an immense icy relief in the fact that the trouble of being born is a finite disaster. Soon the years and the words will dissolve, and the silence that preceded the world will resume its sovereignty. He is ready to be undone, to let the I evaporate, and to finally be as silent as the stars that watch over our meaningless drama. In continuing our exploration of Emil Cioran's dark landscapes, we come to his visceral reflections on the parasitism of the spirit. Cioran suggests that our very consciousness acts as a parasite upon our biological vitality. The more we lean into the trouble of being a thinking creature, the more we drain the raw energy that allows an animal to simply exist. He reflects on how, since his arrival in the year 1911, he felt that his mind was a weapon turned inward. To be born is to be drafted into a war between your instincts and your insights. He observes that the healthy person is the one whose mind is still in service to their body, whereas the philosopher is someone whose mind has rebelled and begun to consume the host. For Cioran, the only way to find peace is to reach a state of exhausted clarity, where the mind has thought its way to the end of its own tether and can no longer find the energy to torture the person who carries it. He delves into the comedy of the will, observing that we are pushed by a mindless biological urge to persevere, despite the evidence of our own eyes. He notes that we celebrate resilience and strength as if they were virtues, when in reality they are often just signs of a stubborn refusal to see the truth. Cioran argues that the trouble of being born is sustained by our inability to admit defeat. We build civilizations and monuments as a way of saying, I am here, even though we know that here is a temporary station in an indifferent universe. He reflects on the year 1992 as a time when he saw the world's frantic activity as a collective flight from the silence of the beginning. He suggests that the ultimate freedom is the ability to say no to the will, to sit in the ruins of your own life and find contentment in the fact that you no longer have to try. This leads us to his startling observations on the longevity of the lie. Cioran suggests that the most successful human institutions, religions, nations, and legal systems are the ones that tell the most elaborate lies about the significance of our arrival. We are born into these stories and we spend our lives defending them, because the alternative, that we are an accidental spark in a cold dark, is too heavy to bear. He argues that the trouble is compounded by our desire for meaning. We are the only creatures who demand a why for our how. Cioran suggests that the beginning of wisdom is the realization that there is no why. We were born because of biological whim in the year 1911, or whatever year you arrived, and we will die because of a biological failure. By stripping away the layers of meaning, we reach a state of transparent despair that is far more honest than the most hopeful theology. Building on this sense of transparent despair, Cioran turns his attention to the curse of the social. He views every human interaction as a form of pollution of the individual's inner silence. From the moment of birth, we are forced into a web of relationships and obligations that we did not choose. We are defined by how others see us, and we spend our lives managing our image as if it were a real thing. Cioran reflects on the year 1993 as a period where he felt the noise of other people's expectations becoming a physical weight. He suggests that the only way to maintain one's sanity in the face of the trouble of being born is to become an internal exile. You must learn to live in the world without being of it, treating your social identity as a costume that you can shed at any moment. He dives into the philosophy of the sneeze, a metaphorical look at the suddenness and absurdity of our existence. He suggests that our arrival in the world was as random and unintentional as a sneeze, yet we spend decades acting as if it were a majestic symphony. He mocks the idea of destiny or fate, seeing these as just self-flattering ways to describe the collision of atoms. He reflects on how the years between 1911 and 1995 were filled with people claiming to have a purpose, and he finds this both hilarious and tragic. The trouble is that we take ourselves so seriously. Cioran argues that we should adopt a comic detachment toward our own lives, viewing our struggles and our sorrows with the same irony that we would view a character in a poorly written play. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics, the aesthetics of the abyss. Cioran had a profound relationship with the concept of the void, viewing it not as a terrifying end, but as a comforting origin. He argues that all the trouble we experience is just a brief interruption of the eternal peace of non-existence. He suggests that we should cultivate a sensibility for the nothing, learning to find beauty in the gaps, the silences, and the disappearances. He looks at a decaying building or a fading memory and sees a return to the natural order of things. For him, the process of living is just the slow evaporation of the I back into the dark air. He finds an immense icy peace in the realization that his name, his work, and his trouble will eventually be forgotten, leaving the universe exactly as it was before his arrival. He concludes this portion of his thought by reflecting on the ultimate honesty. He acknowledges that even his own dark insights are just another way of filling the time. Every book he wrote since his birth was a way of dealing with the trouble of having a mind. He finds it ironic that he became famous for writing about the futility of writing. As he moved toward the end in the year 1995, he felt that his words were finally losing their grip on him. The silence was becoming louder and more attractive. He realized that this disaster of his birth was finally being settled by the grace of his departure. He was ready to stop being a being and return to the state where there is no more year, no more word, and no more trouble. As we continue to navigate the stark intellectual climate of Emil Cioran, we encounter his profound meditations on the inevitability of the biological defeat. He suggests that from the very first breath we draw in the year 1911, or whatever year marks our entry, our lives are a slow-motion surrender to physical decay. The trouble is that we are endowed with a spirit that dreams of the infinite while being anchored to a body that is fundamentally finite. Cioran reflects on how we spend our best years trying to ignore this reality, building muscles and memories as if they were permanent. He argues that the beginning of true philosophical maturity is the moment you stop seeing your body as a partner and start seeing it as a failing machine. For him, every grey hair and every ache is a message from the void, a reminder that the disaster of being born is a debt that is slowly being collected by the earth. He delves into the paradox of the creator. Cioran observes that if there is a god, he must be the most tragic figure in the universe, because he is responsible for the trouble of every being that ever existed. He notes that we often pray for help to the very force that placed us in this predicament. He reflects on the year 1994 as a time when he saw the religious fervour of the world as a form of Stockholm Syndrome. We love the Creator because we are terrified of the emptiness he supposedly filled. Cioran suggests that the most honest theological stance is one of respectful rebellion. We should acknowledge the mystery of the universe while refusing to worship a source that would inflict the burden of consciousness upon us. By rejecting the divine plan, we reclaim our dignity as accidental survivors of a cosmic whim. This leads us to his observations on the futility of the legacy. We're obsessed with the idea of leaving something behind, whether it is children, art, or a reputation. Cioran argues that this is just a frantic attempt to avoid the finality of our departure. He suggests that the trouble is compounded by our desire to be remembered, but he points out that memory is just another form of time, and time eventually swallows everything. He looks back at the names of people who were famous in the year 1920 and notes that they are already whispers. He finds a strange, cold freedom in the idea of being completely forgotten. If you leave nothing behind, you are finally light enough to disappear entirely. This anonymity of the soul is, for him, the only true way to return to the state of the unborn. Building on this sense of anonymity, Cioran turns his gaze toward the curse of the social mask. He observes that we spend our entire lives pretending to be someone, playing a role that was assigned to us by our birth and our culture. We are doctors, citizens, or rebels, but Cioran argues that these are just costumes we wear to hide our internal hollowness. He reflects on the year 1995 as a period where he felt his own mask slipping. He suggests that the only way to endure the trouble of being born is to realize that the I is a fiction. You are not your name, you are not your work, and you are not your sorrows. You are the space in which these things happen. By detaching from the self, you become a witness rather than a victim. He dives into the philosophy of the sunset, looking at the beauty of things as they come to an end. Cioran had a profound appreciation for the late stages of everything, from civilizations to human lives. He argues that growth and beginnings are overvalued, as they are just the start of a new trouble. It is only in the decline, in the fading light, that the true nature of reality is revealed. He suggests that we should aim for a senile wisdom, even in our youth, learning to see the end while we are still in the middle. He reflects on how the years between 1911 and 1995 were filled with people trying to build a future, and he finds an immense irony in their efforts. The only future that is guaranteed is the return to the dark. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of the abyss. Cioran suggests that the void is not something to be feared, but something to be understood as our original home. He argues that all the troubles of life are just waves on the surface of an eternal, calm ocean of non-existence. He looks at the world with a sense of cosmic fatigue, feeling that the species has exhausted its reasons for being. He finds a certain peace in this exhaustion. If there is nothing left to say and nothing left to do, then the trouble is finally over. In his final year, he felt that the distance between his consciousness and the void was narrowing. He was ready to let go of the I and become part of the silence that has watched over the universe for billions of years. There is no more year, no more word, and no more trouble. As we delve deeper into the philosophical fatigue of Emil Cioran, we encounter his biting critique of the illusion of health. Most people view health as the natural, desirable state of the human body, but Cioran argues that health is a deceptive mask that prevents us from seeing the trouble of our condition. He suggests that the healthy man is a superficial man, one who is too full of vitality to notice the void beneath his feet. It is only through the breakdown of the body, through illness, insomnia, or the slow erosion of the years, that a person begins to see clearly. He reflects on how, since his arrival in the year 1911, he viewed his own bouts of sickness not as a misfortune, but as a form of sinister enlightenment. To be ill is to be reminded that the disaster of being born is a physical reality that can no longer be ignored. He looks back at the year 1990, observing a society that has turned the pursuit of longevity into a new religion. We exercise, we diet, and we take supplements to delay the inevitable, yet Cioran finds this effort to be deeply pathetic. He argues that by trying to extend our lives, we are only extending the duration of the trouble. We are like prisoners who are begging for a longer sentence. He suggests that a truly wise person would focus on the quality of their detachment, rather than the quantity of their days. For him, the ideal life is one that prepares itself for the return to the void from the very start. He mocks the idea of fighting death, seeing it as a futile struggle against the only force that can truly release us from the burden of having been born. This leads to his reflections on the comedy of success. Cioran observes that the world is filled with people who are successful in their fields, the famous, the wealthy, and the powerful, yet they are no closer to peace than the most miserable failure. He suggests that success is just a more elaborate way of burying the truth. When you are successful, you're surrounded by noise and flattery. which makes it impossible to hear the silence of your own insignificance. He argues that the trouble is compounded by the ego's desire to be recognized, but he points out that even the greatest fame is just a flicker in the dark. He looks at the year 1926 and notes that most of the great men of that time are now completely forgotten. To Cioran, the only true victory is to have lived a life so quiet and so anonymous that the world has nothing to remember. Building on this advocacy for anonymity, Cioran turns his attention to the curse of the social network. Even before the digital age, he felt that the trouble was exacerbated by the constant pressure to interact with others. He views every conversation as a form of spiritual leakage, where we drain our internal silence to fill the ears of people who do not care. He reflects on the year 1991, considering how the need to be social is actually a fear of being alone with the disaster of one's own birth. We seek the company of others to validate our existence, forgetting that our arrival was a solitary accident. He argues that the beginning of freedom is the ability to be completely alone without feeling the need to justify that loneliness to anyone. He dives into the philosophy of the fragment, explaining why his own thoughts were never organized into a grand, cohesive system. He suggests that a system is a lie, because it assumes the universe is logical and ordered. But Cioran sees the world as a series of random, disconnected troubles. His writing, consisting of short, sharp aphorisms, is an attempt to mirror the fragmented nature of reality. He reflects on how the years between 1911 and 1995 were lived in bursts of insight and long stretches of dullness. He argues that we should stop trying to make our lives into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Instead, we should accept that we are just a collection of disappearing moments. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of disgust. Cioran often spoke of a profound nausea toward the biological facts of existence. He found the processes of digestion, reproduction, and aging to be fundamentally vulgar. He suggests that this disgust is the voice of the spirit protesting against its imprisonment in the flesh. He reflects on how we try to beautify these processes through art, romance, and ritual, but the underlying reality remains the same. We are biological machines that are slowly breaking down. For him, the trouble of being born is the trouble of being a consciousness that is aware of its own organic filth. He looked toward the end not with fear, but as the final cleansing. Death is the moment when the nausea finally stops, and we are allowed to return to the sterile, perfect silence of the uncreated. In exploring the depths of Cioran's intellectual fatigue, we find his sharp critique of the illusion of history and progress. He suggests that history is not a ladder toward perfection, but a repetitive loop of human folly that began with the original disaster of our arrival. He reflects on how, from his birth in the year 1911, he observed the world moving through catastrophic wars and technological revolutions, yet the fundamental trouble of the human condition remained stagnant. Cioran argues that a person born in the year 2026 will face the same existential void as an ancient philosopher, despite the digital complexity surrounding them. He views the concept of progress as a collective anesthetic designed to make the long wait for the end feel purposeful. For him, every historical advance is merely a new way to complicate our misery and distract us from the fact that we are moving toward the same silence that preceded our birth. He delves into the tyranny of social belonging, observing that society is an organized conspiracy to prevent the individual from facing the void alone. From the moment of birth, we are assigned identities, nationalities, religions, and social roles that we are expected to defend with our lives. Cioran suggests that these labels are just weights added to an already unendurable burden. He reflects on how we seek the approval of others to validate a life that we deep down suspect is accidental. He argues that the truly free person is an internal exile, one who has resigned from every community and every cause to embrace their own insignificance. By refusing to belong, one reclaims the right to be as anonymous and unmanifested as the unborn, stripping away the social noise to hear the pure hum of the abyss. This leads us to his startling observations on the aesthetics of the sunset. Cioran had a profound appreciation for everything in decline: fading empires, decaying ruins, and the still slow cooling of the stars. He argues that growth and vitality are vulgar, as they only lead to more trouble and more disappointment. It is only in the late stages of a life or a civilization that the truth is finally revealed, that everything was for nothing. He reflects on the year 1990, a time when he saw the world as a tired garden, nearing its winter. For Cioran, the most beautiful expression of the human spirit is not the shout of triumph, but the quiet, ironic sigh of the person who has seen the end of all things, and found it to be a relief. Building on this sense of relief in decline, Cioran turns his gaze toward the curse of the thinking animal. He suggests that consciousness is a biological error that has turned the human being into a spectator of his own decay. While an animal exists in a state of grace because it does not know it was born, the human being is haunted by the memory of his arrival and the certainty of his departure. Cioran reflects on the year 1991, considering how our intelligence has become a weapon of self-torture. We use our minds to invent meanings that the universe never intended, creating a layer of psychological trouble on top of our physical suffering. He argues that the ultimate goal of philosophy should be to reach a state of unthinking, where the mind finally collapses under the weight of its own questions and returns to the blissful ignorance of the prenatal dark. He explores the vanity of intellectual legacy, looking at the libraries of the world as cemeteries of discarded thoughts. He notes that every writer and philosopher since the beginning of time has tried to leave a mark, yet the earth eventually swallows their names and their works. Cioran reflects on how, between the year 1911 and 1995, he added his own volumes to this pile of dust, only to realize that the most profound insights are those that remain unsaid. He suggests that we should aim for a total disappearance, leaving no footprints and no memories in a world that is already too crowded with ghosts. The trouble is our desire for immortality, when the only true peace is the finality of being forgotten. This brings him to a meditation on the grace of the final resignation. As he approached the end of his own journey, Cioran sought a state of mind where even his own despair became a matter of indifference. He argues that the last stage of wisdom is to lose interest in yourself, to treat your own life as a story happening to a stranger. He looked at the year 1995 not as a looming tragedy, but as the moment when the debt of his birth would finally be cancelled. The trouble of being born is a temporary hardening of the spirit into an I that is fundamentally out of place in an eternal universe. He looked toward the void with a quiet, icy joy, recognizing it as the perfect, unmanifested home he should never have left. He concludes this portion of his thought by reflecting on the ultimate silence of the stars. He notes that while we fill our lives with drama and debate, the universe continues its cold, silent expansion, entirely unaffected by our arrival or our departure. This cosmic indifference is the final answer to all our questions. In his final year, the noise of his words was replaced by the hum of the beginning. The trouble was dissolving, the years were vanishing, and the I was evaporating into the air. He realized that the only true perfection is that which never existed at all, and he was finally ready to return to that state of uncreated peace. In our continued navigation of Cioran's philosophical exhaustion, we encounter his profound disdain for the myth of personal growth. Society suggests that as we age, we should accumulate wisdom and refine our character. Yet Cioran argues that aging is merely a process of witnessing the systematic looting of our vitality. The trouble is that we are born with a surplus of energy that deceives us into thinking we are headed toward a destination. He reflects on how, from the year 1911, he saw his own life as a slow drainage of illusions. We do not grow, we simply become more familiar with our own limitations and the hollowness of our ambitions. He suggests that the only true wisdom is regressive wisdom, the ability to peel back the layers of our personality until we reach the raw, unadorned fact of our accidental arrival. To Cioran, the most honest state of being is that of the disillusioned child, who realizes that the game of life was rigged from the very first breath. He delves into the paradox of the will to live, noting that even those who despise existence are often held hostage by their own biological persistence. This will is a mindless subterranean force that cares nothing for our philosophical insights or our personal suffering. Cioran argues that the trouble of being born is perpetuated by this irrational hunger to endure. He reflects on the year 1988, considering how many people live in absolute misery yet still tremble at the thought of the end. He views this as the ultimate humiliation of the spirit, that the mind can see the exit, but the body refuses to walk through it. For Cioran, the goal of a conscious life is to exhaust the will, to reach a point of such profound fatigue that the biological drive finally gives up and allows the individual to return to the silence of the uncreated. This leads to his observations on the comedy of social responsibility. We are taught that we owe a debt to society, to our family, and to the future, but Cioran argues that our only true debt is to the void we interrupted. The trouble is that we are drafted into a social contract we never signed. He mocks the idea of duty, seeing it as just another way to keep the machinery of suffering in motion. He suggests that the most radical act of integrity is to be irresponsible, to refuse to participate in the collective delusions that keep humanity striving toward a non-existent goal. By resigning from our roles as citizens and producers, we reclaim a small fragment of the peace that was ours before the year 1911. Building on this theme of resignation, Cioran turns his attention to the curse of the narrative. We are born into a world of stories, and we spend our lives trying to make our own existence fit into a coherent plot. But Cioran argues that life is fundamentally non-linear and nonsensical. The trouble is that we try to bridge the gaps between our random sensations with logic and meaning. He reflects on the year 1991, observing how people use their memories to construct a fake sense of self. He suggests that we should treat our lives as a series of unconnected accidents, rather than a journey with a destination. By abandoning our story, we lose the weight of our past and the anxiety of our future. We become like the unborn, existing in a state where there is no before and no after, only the immediate empty present. He explores the vanity of religious solace, looking at the various heavens and afterlives promised by theology as nothing more than cosmic bribes to keep us from noticing the darkness. Cioran suggests that if there were a paradise, it would be the absence of being, not the continuation of it. He reflects on how, between the year 1911 and 1995, he saw religion as a form of spiritual cowardice, the inability to face the trouble of birth without a protective myth. He argues that the only true holiness is found in the courage to be nothing. He finds an icy beauty in the realization that there is no one watching and no one waiting. This cosmic isolation is the only thing that gives us true sovereignty over our own despair. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of the final departure. As he reached the final years of his journey, Cioran became fascinated by the lightness that comes with letting go. He argues that the last stage of a human life should be a process of liquidation, selling off our attachments, our beliefs, and our pride until we are as light as a shadow. He looked at the year 1995 not as a finish line but as a dissolving. The trouble of being born is a temporary thickening of reality. Death is the final thinning. He suggests that we should welcome the fading of our memories and the decline of our senses as signs that the accident of our arrival is finally being corrected. He concludes this portion of his thought by reflecting on the ultimate indifference of the void. He notes that despite all our shouting and all our philosophy, the silence of the beginning remains untouched. We are like ripples on a dark pond that disappear without leaving a trace. In his final year, the years and the words felt like they belonged to someone else. The trouble was no longer a burden, but a fading echo. He realizes that the only thing that ever truly mattered was the return to the perfect, unproductive peace of the uncreated. The years between 1911 and 1995 were just a brief, noisy interruption of a silence that is eternal. To move further into the final layers of this philosophy is to confront the sovereignty of the abyss. Cioran suggests that our entire existence is merely a brief, noisy interruption of a silence that is both our origin and our ultimate destination. The trouble is that we treat this interruption as if it were a solid reality, building elaborate structures of belief and identity to hide the fact that we are standing on nothing. He reflects on how, from the year 1911, he saw the world as a place where people are condemned to be. We are forced to carry the weight of a consciousness that knows its own futility, yet we are denied the simple grace of non-existence. Cioran argues that the only honest path is to acknowledge this illegitimacy of our arrival. By realizing that we were never meant to be, we can finally stop trying to justify our presence and simply wait for the return of the dark. He delves into the comedy of intellectual ambition. He observes that the philosopher and the scientist spend their lives trying to solve the universe, as if it were a riddle with a logical answer. But Cioran suggests that the universe is not a problem to be solved. It is a disaster to be endured. He reflects on the year 1992, a time when he saw the accumulation of human knowledge as nothing more than a growing pile of elegant lies. Every theory, from the four elements of the ancients to the superstrings of the moderns, is just another way of filling the silence with noise. He argues that the more we understand, the more we lose touch with the raw, unadorned fact of our own insignificance. For Cioran, true wisdom is the ability to reach a state of perfect ignorance, where the mind no longer seeks to explain the why and is content to witness the how of its own disappearance. This leads us to his observations on the tyranny of the social contract. We are born into a web of obligations to our nation, our family, and our history that we did not choose and cannot escape. Cioran suggests that this social entrapment is a primary source of the trouble. We are forced to be citizens and producers when we should have remained unborn. He reflects on how, between the year 1911 and 1995, he saw society as a collective effort to keep the original disaster of birth in motion. He argues that the only true freedom is to become an internal deserter, one who lives in the world without participating in its delusions. By resigning from the human mission, we reclaim the right to be as empty and as silent as the void itself. Building on this theme of desertion, Cioran turns his gaze toward the curse of time and memory. He suggests that we are the only creatures who are tortured by the arrow of time, always pointing away from our origin and toward our end. While an animal exists in a state of eternal now, the human being is burdened with a past that he cannot change and a future that he cannot control. Cioran reflects on the year 1993 as a time when he felt the heaviness of the decades. He argues that memory is a mechanism of self-torture, keeping the trouble of our mistakes and our losses alive long after they should have faded. He suggests that we should aim for a spiritual amnesia, learning to let go of our history so that we can finally experience the lightness of being nothing. He explores the vanity of the artistic legacy. Cioran looks at the great works of art and literature not as triumphs, but as symptoms of a deep existential disease. We create because we cannot bear the silence of our own hearts. He reflects on how, throughout his life, he contributed to this noise, writing books to deal with the catastrophe of having a mind. He finds a profound irony in the fact that his words about the futility of expression have become part of the cultural record. He argues that the most profound art is the one that is never made, the silent internal realization of the abyss. He suggests that we should treat our own lives as masterpieces of disappearance, aiming to leave no trace in a world that is already too full of ghosts and memories. This brings him to a meditation on the grace of the final exit. As he reached the final chapters of his own journey, Cioran became increasingly focused on the beauty of the finish line. He argues that the trouble of being born is a temporary condition that is eventually corrected by the permanence of being gone. He reflects on the year 1995 as the moment when the debt of vitality would finally be settled. He looks toward death not as an enemy, but as the ultimate unbirth, the moment when the I finally evaporates back into the universal dark. He finds an immense icy peace in the realization that the universe will continue its silent, indifferent expansion, entirely unaffected by his arrival or his departure. He concludes this portion of his thought by reflecting on the ultimate dominance of the beginning. He notes that despite all our shouting and all our philosophy, the void remains untouched and unbothered. We are like brief ripples on a deep dark pond that disappear without leaving a mark. In his final year, the years and the words felt like they belonged to someone else. The trouble was no longer a burden, but a fading echo in an eternal night. He realized that the only thing that ever truly mattered was the return to the perfect, unproductive peace of the uncreated. The years between 1911 and 1995 were just a brief, noisy dream, and the dreamer was finally waking up to the silence. As we advance into the final stages of Emil Cioran's meditations, we must look at his profound skepticism toward the illusion of moral progress. We are taught to believe that as civilizations age, they become more ethical and more refined. But Cioran suggests that we have only found more sophisticated ways to mask the original trouble. He reflects on the year 1991, observing that despite our grand declarations of human rights and universal peace, the human animal remains fundamentally driven by the same dark biological impulses that existed at the dawn of time. The catastrophe of birth is not something that can be mitigated by better laws or kinder societies. For Cioran, the trouble is an ontological one. It is built into the very fabric of being alive. No amount of social engineering can remove the dread that comes with a consciousness that knows it is accidental and temporary. He delves into the tyranny of the senses, noting that our eyes, ears and nerves are the primary agents of our deception. They provide us with a colourful, noisy version of the world that keeps us interested in staying alive. Cioran argues that the trouble of being born is perpetuated by the constant stream of sensations that prevent us from noticing the void. He suggests that a truly spiritual life would be one of sensory deprivation, a deliberate turning away from the theatre of the world to face the internal silence. He reflects on how, from the year 1911, he felt that his own senses were like informants for a cruel government, always bringing back reports of beauty and pleasure to justify his imprisonment in the flesh. To Cioran, the only way to reach a state of grace is to become dead to the world before you actually die. This leads us to his observations on the comedy of philanthropy. Cioran often mocked the idea of helping others, thinking it as just another way to distract oneself from one's own insignificance. He suggests that the most compassionate thing you can do for another person is to help them realise the futility of their strivings. By encouraging people to hope and to strive, we are only prolonging their suffering in the trouble of existence. He argues for a solidarity of the abyss, where we acknowledge our shared disaster without trying to fix it. He reflects on the years between 1911 and 1995 as a period where he saw the do-gooders of the world as the most deluded of all, as they believed they could perform a repair on a universe that was never meant to function in the first place. Building on this theme of shared futility, Cioran turns his gaze toward the curse of the name and the legacy. He observes that we spend our entire lives trying to turn our names into something solid, as if the letters of our identity could somehow act as an anchor in the void. He reflects on the year 1994, a time when he felt his own literary reputation as a heavy, useless shadow. To Cioran, the desire for a legacy is the ultimate sign of a person who has not yet accepted the catastrophe of their birth. He argues that we should aim for total anonymity, longing for the day when our names will be forgotten and our work will turn to dust. The trouble is our attachment to the I, the persistent feeling that we are important, when in reality the universe is a machine of disappearance. He explores the philosophy of the bed, a meditation on the state of rest and its relationship to the void. Cioran believed that the most honest posture for a human being is lying down in a state of complete inactivity. When we are upright and moving, we are under the spell of vitality, but when we are still, we begin to align ourselves with the silence of the beginning. He reflects on the years of his life spent in the quiet rooms of Paris, viewing his own inertia as a form of sacred resistance. The trouble of being born is a problem of movement, the urge to be somewhere and do something. By choosing to do nothing, we perform a small undoing of our birth. He suggests that the bed is the last refuge of the philosopher, the place where we can most clearly feel the proximity of the unborn state. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of the final cold. Cioran had a profound appreciation for the cooling of the heart that comes with old age. He suggests that the passions of our youth were just a fever that blinded us to the true nature of things. As we age and our desires fade, we reach a state of icy lucidity, where we can finally see the world without the distortions of hope or fear. He reflects on the year 1995 as a period of perfect crystalline clarity. He looked toward the end, not with warmth, but with the quiet anticipation of a stone returning to the earth. The trouble of being born is a temporary heat. Death is the eternal cooling. He concludes this phase of his thoughts by reflecting on the ultimate indifference of the stars. He notes that whether we find meaning or remain in despair, the universe continues its cold, silent expansion, entirely unaffected by our arrival or our departure. This cosmic indifference is the final answer to all our prayers. In his final year, the years and the words felt like they were dissolving into a vast white noise. He realized that the only thing that ever truly mattered was the return to the perfect, unproductive peace of the uncreated. The years between 1911 and 1995 were just a brief, noisy interruption of a silence that is eternal. In our continuing descent into the final layers of Emil Cioran's thought, we must address his profound rejection of the myth of historical continuity. We are raised to believe that our lives are part of a grand, unbroken chain of human experience, yet Cioran suggests that every birth is a violent interruption that forces us to start the tragedy anew. The trouble is that we are born into a world that is already exhausted, a landscape littered with the corpses of dead ideas and failed revolutions. He reflects on the year 1991, observing that while the political maps of the world were being redrawn, the fundamental isolation of the human soul remained as deep as ever. He argues that history does not move toward a goal. It merely shifts its weight from one foot to the other. For Cioran, the only honest way to view the timeline of humanity is as a series of disconnected screams. We do not learn from the past, we only inherit its fatigue. He delves into the tyranny of the senses, observing how our physical perceptions are designed to trap us in the mirage of the present. Our eyes and ears provide us with a colourful, noisy version of reality that keeps us invested in staying alive. Cioran argues that the trouble of being born is perpetuated by this constant sensory input, which prevents us from noticing the void that surrounds us. He suggests that a truly spiritual life would be one of systematic detachment from the senses. He reflects on his arrival in the year 1911 and notes that his entire life was a struggle to see through the optical illusion of existence. To Cioran, the only way to reach a state of grace is to become a ghost in one's own body, a consciousness that observes its physical sensations without being fooled by them. This leads us to his observations on the comedy of social utility. We are taught that we must be useful to society, to our families, and to the future, but Cioran argues that this is just another way to distract us from our own insignificance. He suggests that the most radical act of integrity is to be useless, to refuse to participate in the collective effort to keep the machinery of suffering in motion. He reflects on the years between 1911 and 1995 as a period where he saw the workers of the world as the most deluded of all, as they believed their labour could somehow justify the catastrophe of their birth. By choosing a life of inactivity and reflection, Cioran performed a small undoing of his arrival. He sought to return to the unproductive peace of the uncreated while still in the flesh. Building on this theme of inactivity, Cioran turns his attention to the curse of the legacy and the name. He observes that we spend our entire lives trying to turn our names into something solid, as if the letters of our identity could somehow act as an anchor in the void. He reflects on the year 1994, a time when he felt his own literary reputation as a heavy, useless shadow. To Cioran, the desire for a legacy is the ultimate sign of a person who has not yet accepted the finality of their departure. He argues that we should aim for total anonymity, longing for the day when our names will be forgotten and our work will turn to dust. The trouble is our attachment to the I, the persistent feeling that we are important, when in reality the universe is a machine of disappearance. He explores the philosophy of the final stillness, looking at the state of sleep as a temporary return to the void. Cioran believed that sleep is the only time we are truly saved, because it is the only time we forget we were born. He reflects on the years of his life spent battling insomnia, viewing it as a cruel punishment that forced him to witness the passage of time without any respite. The trouble of being born is a problem of consciousness, the inability to stop being an I. By pursuing sleep and ultimately death, we are seeking to return to the blissful state of the unborn. He suggests the bed is the last refuge of the philosopher, the place where we can most clearly feel the proximity of the beginning. Lying in the dark, the noise of the world fades, and the silence of the abyss starts to hum in the ears. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of the final cold. Cioran had a profound appreciation for the cooling of the heart that comes with old age. He suggests that the passions of our youth were just a fever that blinded us to the true nature of things. As we age and our desires fade, we reach a state of icy lucidity, where we can finally see the world without the distortions of hope or fear. He reflects on the year 1995 as a period of perfect crystalline clarity. He looked toward the end not with warmth, but with the quiet anticipation of a stone returning to the earth. The trouble of being born is a temporary heat. Death is the eternal cooling. He concludes this phase of his thoughts by reflecting on the ultimate indifference of the stars. He notes that whether we find meaning or remain in despair, the universe continues its cold, silent expansion, entirely unaffected by our arrival or our departure. This cosmic indifference is the final answer to all our prayers. In his final year, the years and the words felt like they were dissolving into a vast white noise. He realized that the only thing that ever truly mattered was the return to the perfect, unproductive peace of the uncreated. The years between 1900 and 11 and 1995 were just a brief, noisy interruption of a silence that is eternal. As we continue to traverse the stark philosophical landscape of Emil Cioran, we find his sharpest arrows aimed at the illusion of moral choice. We are raised to believe that our characters are forged through the crucible of our decisions, yet Cioran suggests that our trouble is a biological destiny from which there is no escape. He reflects on how, from his arrival in the year 1911, he saw human morality as a desperate attempt to put a decorative coat of paint on a crumbling wall. We invent virtues to mask our instincts and sins to explain our failures, but the underlying reality is a mindless, indifferent flow of time. He argues that a man born in the year 2026 is no more free than a man born in antiquity. Both are merely reacting to the chemical and historical pressures of their moment. For Cioran, the only true choice is the internal decision to stop participating in the delusion of being a moral agent. He delves into the sovereignty of the abyss, observing that we spend our lives building elaborate structures of belief and identity to avoid looking at the nothingness that sustains us. He suggests that every social interaction, every career milestone, and every romantic attachment is just a handful of sand thrown into a bottomless pit. He reflects on the year 1990 as a time when he felt the hollowness of the world more acutely than ever. To Cioran, the trouble of being born is a problem of solidity. We try to make our accidental lives feel solid and permanent when they are actually as fluid as smoke. He argues that the beginning of wisdom is to embrace this fluidity, to realize that we are just placeholders for a balance that is far more real than we are. This leads us to his observations on the comedy of human legacy. Cioran often mocked the idea of leaving something behind, seeing it as the ultimate sign of a person who has not yet accepted their own insignificance. He suggests that the desire for immortality through art or family is a form of spiritual greed. He reflects on the years between 1911 and 1995 as a period where he saw the great libraries and monuments of the world as nothing more than memorials to vanity. He argues that we should aim for a perfect disappearance, longing for the day when our names will be forgotten and our work will return to the earth. The trouble is our attachment to the I, and the only cure is the realization that the universe is a machine designed to erase us. Building on this theme of disappearance, Cioran turns his attention to the curse of the social mask. He observes that we spend our entire lives pretending to be someone, playing a role that was assigned to us by our birth and our culture. We are citizens, workers, or parents, but Cioran argues that these are just costumes we wear to hide our internal void. He reflects on the year 1995 as a period where he felt his own mask slipping away entirely. He suggests that the only way to endure the trouble of being born is to realize that the I is a fiction. You're not your name, you're not your work, and you're not your sorrows. You're the empty stage upon which these things happen. By detaching from the self, you become a witness rather than a victim. He explores the philosophy of the sunset, looking at the beauty of things as they come to an end. Cioran had a profound appreciation for the late stages of everything, from civilizations to human lives. He argues that growth and beginnings are overvalued, as they are just the start of a new cycle of suffering. It is only in the decline, in the fading light, that the true nature of reality is revealed. He suggests that we should aim for a senile wisdom, even in our youth, learning to see the end while we are still in the middle. He reflects on how the years between 1911 and 1995 were filled with people trying to build a future, and he finds an immense irony in their efforts. The only future that is guaranteed is the return to the dark. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of the abyss. Cioran suggests that the void is not something to be feared, but something to be understood as our original and final home. He argues that all the troubles of life are just waves on the surface of an eternal calm ocean of non-existence. He looks at the world with a sense of cosmic fatigue, feeling that the species has exhausted its reasons for being. He finds a certain peace in this exhaustion. If there is nothing left to say and nothing left to do, then the trouble is finally over. In his final year, he felt that the distance between his consciousness and the void was narrowing. He was ready to let go of the I and become part of the silence that has watched over the universe for billions of years. He concludes this portion of his thought by reflecting on the ultimate silence of the beginning. He notes that despite all our shouting and all our philosophy, the void remains untouched and unbothered. We are like brief ripples on a deep, dark pond that disappear without leaving a mark. In his final year, the years and the words felt like they belonged to someone else. The trouble was no longer a burden, but a fading echo in an eternal night. He realized that the only thing that ever truly mattered was the return to the perfect, unproductive peace of the uncreated. The years between 1911 and 1995 were just a brief, noisy interruption of a silence that is eternal. In our relentless progression through the final corridors of Emil Cioran's thought, we must confront his profound rejection of the myth of historical continuity. We are raised to believe that our lives are part of a grand, unbroken chain of human experience, yet Cioran suggests that every birth is a violent interruption that forces us to start the tragedy anew. The trouble is that we are born into a world that is already exhausted, a landscape littered with the corpses of dead ideas and failed revolutions. He reflects on the year 1991, observing that while the political maps of the world were being redrawn, the fundamental isolation of the human soul remained as deep as ever. He argues that history does not move toward a goal, it merely shifts its weight from one foot to the other. For Cioran, the only honest way to view the timeline of humanity is as a series of disconnected screams. We do not learn from the past, we only inherit its fatigue. He delves into the tyranny of the senses, observing how our physical perceptions are designed to trap us in the mirage of the present. Our eyes and ears provide us with a colourful, noisy version of reality that keeps us invested in staying alive. Cioran argues that the trouble of being born is perpetuated by this constant sensory input, which prevents us from noticing the void that surrounds us. He suggests that a truly spiritual life would be one of systematic detachment from the senses. He reflects on his arrival in the year 1911 and notes that his entire life was a struggle to see through the optical illusion of existence. To Cioran, the only way to reach a state of grace is to become a ghost in one's own body, a consciousness that observes its physical sensations without being fooled by them. This leads us to his observations on the comedy of social utility. We are taught that we must be useful to society, to our families, and to the future, but Cioran argues that this is just another way to distract us from our own insignificance. He suggests that the most radical act of integrity is to be useless, to refuse to participate in the collective effort to keep the machinery of suffering in motion. He reflects on the years between 1911 and 1995 as a period where he saw the workers of the world as the most deluded of all, as they believed their labour could somehow justify the catastrophe of their birth. By choosing a life of inactivity and reflection, Cioran performed a small undoing of his arrival. He sought to return to the unproductive peace of the uncreated, while still in the flesh. Building on this theme of inactivity, Cioran turns his attention to the curse of the legacy and the name. He observes that we spend our entire lives trying to turn our names into something solid, as if the letters of our identity could somehow act as an anchor in the void. He reflects on the year 1994, a time when he felt his own literary reputation as a heavy, useless shadow. To Cioran, the desire for a legacy is the ultimate sign of a person who has not yet accepted the finality of their departure. He argues that we should aim for total anonymity, longing for the day when our names will be forgotten and our work will turn to dust. The trouble is our attachment to the I, the persistent feeling that we are important, when in reality the universe is a machine of disappearance. He explores the philosophy of the final stillness, looking at the state of sleep as a temporary return to the void. Cioran believed that sleep is the only time we are truly saved, because it is the only time we forget we are born. He reflects on the years of his life spent battling insomnia, viewing it as a cruel punishment that forced him to witness the passage of time without any respite. The trouble of being born is a problem of consciousness, the inability to stop being an I. By pursuing sleep, and ultimately death, we are seeking to return to the blissful state of the unborn. He suggests that the bed is the last refuge of the philosopher, the place where we can most clearly feel the proximity of the beginning. Lying in the dark, the noise of the world fades, and the silence of the abyss starts to hum in the ears. This brings him to a meditation on the aesthetics of the final cold. Cioran had a profound appreciation for the cooling of the heart that comes with old age. He suggests that the passions of our youth were just a fever that blinded us to the true nature of things. As we age and our desires fade, we reach a state of icy lucidity, where we can finally see the world without the distortions of hope or fear. He reflects on the year 1995 as a period of perfect crystalline clarity. He looked toward the end not with warmth, but with the quiet anticipation of a stone returning to the earth. The trouble of being born is a temporary heat. Death is the eternal gas cooling. He concludes this phase of his thoughts by reflecting on the ultimate indifference of the stars. He notes that whether we find meaning or remain in despair, the universe continues its cold, silent expansion, entirely unaffected by our arrival or our departure. This cosmic indifference is the final answer to all our prayers. In his final year, the years and the words felt like the phase were dissolving into a vast white noise. He realized that the only thing that ever truly mattered was the return to the perfect, unproductive peace of the uncreated. The years between 1911 and 1995 were just a brief, noisy interruption of a silence that is eternal. As we reach the penultimate stage of our journey through Emil Cioran's meditations, we must look at the sovereignty of the abyss as the only absolute truth. We are born into a world of distractions, work, social roles, and intellectual pursuits, all designed to hide the fact that we are standing on nothing. Cioran suggests that throughout our lives, from the year 1911 to the very end, we are merely placeholders for an emptiness that is our original and final state. The trouble is that we treat our temporary crystallization into an eye as if it were a solid fortress, when it is actually just a thin layer of frost over an infinite dark sea. He argues that the most honest realization a human can have is that they are an intruder in the world of the living, a guest who has overstayed their welcome in a house they never intended to visit. He delves into the paradox of choice and destiny, noting that while we believe we are free, we are actually bound by the biological and historical chains forged at our birth. We did not choose our temperament, our parents, or the era into which we were thrust, yet we are held responsible for the outcomes of these accidents. Cioran reflects on the year 1994 as a time when he saw the world's frantic activity as a collective flight from this realization. He suggests that the ultimate freedom is not the power to do, but the power to refuse. By resigning from the race for success and meaning, we reclaim our dignity as survivors of a cosmic whim. We return to the state of the unborn while still in the flesh, becoming ghosts in the machinery of life who can no longer be hurt by its demands. This leads to his observations on the silence of the stars. He notes that while we fill our lives with drama, the universe continues its cold, silent expansion, entirely unaffected by our arrival or our departure. This cosmic indifference is the final answer to all our prayers and all our philosophies. He finds an immense icy peace in the realization that our troubles are local and temporary. In the grand scale of reality, the year 1911 and the year 1995 are indistinguishable points in a darkness that has no memory. We are echoes of echoes, and the only true perfection is the return to the silence that was there before the world began. In this final section, we come to the conclusion of the disaster, which is also the only possible happy ending in Cioran's world, the return to non-existence. He reflects on the years between 1911 and 1995 as a brief, noisy interruption of an eternal peace. The trouble of being born is a debt of energy that we eventually pay back to the earth, and death is the moment the account is finally sacrificed. He looks back at his own lifetime of words and realizes that every sentence was just a way of filling the time while waiting for the end. The philosopher who spent his life documenting the catastrophe of arrival is finally ready to embrace the grace of departure. He reflects on the final dissolution of the ego. As the end approaches, the mask of the I slips away, and we realize that the person we spent so long defending never truly existed. We are not our names, our works, or our sorrows. We are merely the space in which the trouble happened for a few decades. Cioran finds an elegant beauty in this vanishing. He suggests that we should aim to unbecome ourselves, melting back into the void like mist in the morning sun. In the year 1995, he felt the proximity of the beginning as a cooling breeze. The noise of the world was fading, and the perfect, unproductive peace of the uncreated was finally taking its place once again. He concludes his journey by acknowledging that the ultimate secret of the universe is that there is no secret. There is no why to our arrival, and no destination for our departure. We were a biological accident that occurred in a silent universe, and we are returning to that silence without having changed a single thing. This realization is not a tragedy. It is the ultimate liberation from the burden of meaning. We can finally stop searching, stop striving, and stop suffering. The trouble is over. The years have vanished, the words have dissolved, and the silence is sovereign once more. We are home in the place we should never have left, where there is no more year, no more word, and no more I.